11 Pacific Northwest Horror Stories. Welcome to Dark North Stories family. We got the place where your worst nightmares are someone else's reality. I'm your host, and I've spent years digging through police files, Reddit confessions, and witness testimonies to bring you the stories that'll make your skin crawl and your blood run cold. So, turn off the lights, check your locks one more time, and prepare yourself for stories that will have you, yes my dear you, haunted long after the video ends. Stay safe, stay connected, and if you are riding, turn on the roof light. They say working night shifts in the Pacific Northwest forests changes you. Some rangers come back different, quieter, like they've seen something they can never unsee. Others never come back at all. I used to think those stories were just campfire tales meant to scare rookies. I was wrong. What I encountered at the old Deception Pass Ranger Station didn't just change me. It made me realize that some things have been living in these woods long before we arrived, and they're not happy we're here. I worked as a seasonal park ranger in Washington State for 3 summers, and what happened at the old Deception Pass Station still keeps me up at night. This was back in 2019, and I was 22 years old, excited to spend my summer in the beautiful Pacific Northwest forests. Fresh out of college with a degree in environmental science, I thought I knew everything about the wilderness. I'd studied ecology, wildlife management, forest ecosystems. I'd read every textbook and passed every test. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what waited for me in that isolated ranger station. They assigned me to cover the night shifts at an older ranger station near the pass because the regular guy had quit suddenly, without giving any reason. My supervisor, Mark, seemed nervous when he handed me the keys and told me the station had been empty for almost 2 months. He said something about budget cuts, but I could tell he was lying because his hands were shaking when he gave me the orientation paperwork. His eyes kept darting away from mine, and he kept clearing his throat, like he wanted to say something but couldn't quite get the words out. I remember thinking it was strange, but I chalked it up to bureaucratic stress. Rangers were always complaining about funding cuts and staffing shortages. The station was a small wooden building, built in the 1960s, with 2 rooms, 1 main office area with old filing cabinets and a desk, and a back room with a cot for overnight stays. The paint was peeling, and everything smelled like mildew and old coffee. There were these huge windows facing the forest, and during the day you could see the beautiful Douglas firs, and the sound of birds was actually peaceful. The whole place had that abandoned feeling, like it had been sitting empty much longer than 2 months. Dust covered everything, and there were cobwebs in the corners that looked ancient. The wooden floorboards creaked with every step, and the whole structure seemed to settle and groan when the wind picked up. My job was simple: monitor the radio for emergencies, do a perimeter walk every few hours, and keep the logbook updated. The first week was boring, and I spent most nights reading books and browsing my phone when I had signal, which wasn't often this deep in the forest. I'd walk the perimeter with my flashlight, checking the trails and making sure no one was camping illegally. Most nights I'd see deer or raccoons, and occasionally hear coyotes in the distance. It was peaceful in a lonely sort of way. I'd make coffee on the old electric hot plate and sit at the desk doing paperwork or studying field guides. Then I started noticing the scratches. They were on the inside of the back room door, long, deep gouges in the wood that went from about shoulder height all the way down to the floor. At first, I thought maybe I just hadn't noticed them before, but as the days went on, they seemed more prominent, more disturbing. The gouges were deep, carved into the solid wood door with what must have been incredible force. I ran my fingers along them and felt how the wood had splintered and torn. I asked Mark about them on my next check-in, and he got really quiet for a moment before saying something about a bear getting in years ago. But these scratches were on the inside of the door, which made no sense. Why would a bear scratch to get out of a room when the window was right there? The window wasn't even locked. It opened easily when I checked it. A bear would have just gone through the window or broken it. These scratches looked desperate, frantic, like something had been trapped in that room and was trying to claw its way out. I tried not to think about it too much, but every time I had to go into the back room, I'd look at those marks and feel uneasy. Around my 3rd week, I was doing my 2 a.m. perimeter walk with my flashlight when I heard something moving in the woods, about 50 feet from the station. It sounded big, like something pushing through the underbrush without caring about making noise. I stopped and pointed my flashlight toward the sound, but all I could see were trees and darkness. The beam of my flashlight only penetrated about 30 feet into the dense forest before being swallowed by shadows. Then I heard it, a sound like someone trying to talk, but their mouth was full of water, gurgling, wet, and wrong. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard in my studies or in the field. It was almost human, but distorted, like someone was trying to form words but couldn't quite manage it. I stood there frozen for maybe 10 seconds before I ran back to the station and locked the door. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the key. I radioed Mark, but he didn't respond. It was the middle of the night, so I sat at the desk with all the lights on and watched the windows until sunrise. Nothing appeared, but I could hear that wet, gurgling sound circling the station for hours. It would move from one side to another, sometimes close enough that I could hear branches snapping under its weight, sometimes farther away but still audible. I counted the circuits. 14 times it circled the station before the sound finally faded as dawn approached. I didn't sleep at all that night. When Mark came by the next morning, I told him everything and he went pale. His reaction scared me more than the sound had. He didn't laugh it off or suggest it was just an elk or a bear. Instead, he made me sit down and then he told me about David, the ranger who quit. David had been working nights for 2 years, and apparently he'd been filing reports about strange sounds and movements around the station. Mark showed me the reports on his laptop, and my stomach dropped. David described the exact same gurgling sound, and he'd seen something he called the visitor. According to his last report, dated 3 days before he quit, David had been in the back room trying to sleep when he heard scratching on the window. He looked and saw a face pressed against the glass, but it wasn't quite right. He wrote that the proportions were wrong. Eyes too far apart and mouth too wide, and the skin looked gray and wet, like something that had been underwater too long. David screamed and the thing disappeared, but when he went outside to look the next morning, there were handprints on the window that looked almost human, except the fingers were too long, and there were only 4 of them. Mark said David refused to come back after that night, and they couldn't find anyone else willing to take the position until I applied. The other rangers knew about the station's reputation, but no one had told me. I should have quit right then, but I was young and stupid, and honestly, I needed the money. My student loans weren't going to pay themselves, and seasonal ranger positions were hard to come by. Mark offered to have someone else cover my shifts, but I said no because I didn't want to look scared. I didn't want to be the ranger who couldn't handle a little weirdness. That was a mistake. Probably the biggest mistake of my life. The next few nights were quiet, and I started thinking maybe David had imagined things, or maybe it was just some weird animal I wasn't familiar with. Maybe it was a sick seal that had wandered up from the pass, or some other marine animal displaced by the tides. I tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation that would let me sleep at night. I researched strange animal sounds online, listened to recordings of seals, sea lions, and walruses. Nothing matched what I'd heard. Then, on Saturday night, during my 3 a.m. perimeter walk, I found the deer. It was about 30 yards from the station. A full-grown doe that looked like it had been torn apart by something with incredible strength. But that's not what scared me the most. The deer had been arranged in a circle, with its legs pointing outward, and its head placed in the center facing up. The arrangement was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Blood had pooled in the center around the head, and the doe's eyes were still open, staring up at the sky. No animal does that. Animals kill to eat, not to make patterns. This was something else, something with intelligence and purpose. I took photos with my phone and radioed Mark immediately, even though it was the middle of the night. He answered on the second call, and I could hear his wife yelling in the background, asking what was wrong. Mark told me to get back inside the station and lock everything, and he'd be there in 40 minutes. The drive from his house to the station normally took 30 minutes, but he said he'd speed. His voice had an edge of panic that made my own fear spike higher. I ran back and locked myself in, and that's when I noticed the smell. It was like rotting fish mixed with wet earth, so strong it made my eyes water. The smell was coming from the back room. I didn't want to look, but I had to make sure nothing had gotten inside somehow. I opened the door slowly, with my flashlight up and my hand on my pepper spray. The room looked empty, but the smell was overwhelming, and there was water all over the floor even though there were no pipes in that room. Puddles of dark water that looked almost oily in my flashlight beam. Then I saw it in the corner behind the cot. At first, I thought it was a pile of wet clothes, but then it moved. The thing stood up slowly, and it was tall, maybe 7 feet, with skin that looked like it was rotting and covered in pond scum. Its arms were too long and ended in those 4-fingered hands David had described. The joints bent wrong, too many knuckles, and the fingers had webbing between them like a frog. But the face was the worst part. It had eyes like a fish, flat and dead and too far apart, and when it opened its mouth, I could see rows of small, sharp teeth like a lamprey. It made that gurgling sound again and took a step toward me. I slammed the door, shoved the desk against it, and grabbed the radio, screaming for Mark to hurry. The thing started pounding on the door so hard the whole station shook, and I could hear wood splintering. The sound was deafening, rhythmic pounding that seemed to shake the entire building. I ran out the front door into the parking lot and got in my truck, locking the doors. Through the station windows, I could see the thing moving around inside, knocking over filing cabinets and tearing papers. Pressed its face against the window and looked right at me, and I swear, it smiled. That smile is burned into my memory. Too wide, full of those needle teeth, completely inhuman, but somehow intelligent.
Story number 2.
My name is Derek Paulson, and I was a wilderness ranger for the Mount Hood National Forest in Oregon for 7 years, before I requested a transfer to desk work at the Forest Service headquarters in Portland. I'm 34 years old now, and what happened to me 2 years ago in the backcountry still makes me check over my shoulder constantly. I need to tell the story because people keep going missing in that forest, and the official explanations never tell the whole truth. Mount Hood National Forest covers over 1 million acres of wilderness in northern Oregon, with hundreds of miles of hiking trails and dozens of remote areas that see maybe a handful of visitors per year. My job was to patrol the backcountry areas, maintain trails, check on campers, and respond to emergencies. I loved it because I got to spend weeks alone in the wilderness with just my gear and my thoughts. The forest assigned me to the Timothy Lake area, which includes some of the most remote sections on the east side of Mount Hood. There's a small ranger cabin near Clackamas Lake that serves as a base for backcountry patrols. The cabin was built in the 1950s, just one room with a wood stove, a cot, and shelves for supplies. No electricity, no running water, just a basic shelter for rangers doing extended patrols. I'd stay there for 2 weeks at a time during summer and fall, hiking out during the day to check trails and campsites, then returning to the cabin at night. In September 2022, I started a normal 2-week rotation. The weather was perfect, cool mornings and warm afternoons, and the fall colors were just starting. I hiked into the cabin on a Monday afternoon, about 8 miles from the nearest trailhead, and got settled in. The cabin had a logbook where rangers were supposed to record their activities and any unusual observations. I flipped through it while I was unpacking and noticed the previous ranger, a guy named Scott, had made some strange entries. Most entries were normal stuff like trail conditions and wildlife sightings, but his last few entries from August were different. August 19th, he wrote, "Heard voices near cabin at 2 a.m., investigated but found nobody." August 21st, he wrote, "Tracks around cabin, barefoot human prints, no explanation." August 24th, his entry just said, "Leaving early, something wrong here, recommend full inspection before next rotation." I knew Scott a little bit. He was an experienced ranger who'd been with the Forest Service for over 15 years. Not the type to spook easily. I made a note to ask him about it when I got back to headquarters. That first night at the cabin was quiet. I cooked dinner on the wood stove, wrote my first log entry, and went to sleep around 9 p.m. because I had a long hike planned for the next day. I woke up suddenly at 2:13 a.m. According to my watch, something had woken me, but I wasn't sure what. I lay there listening, and then I heard it, voices outside the cabin, multiple voices talking in normal conversational tones like people having a casual chat. I sat up and grabbed my flashlight. The voices were coming from right outside the cabin door, maybe 10 feet away. I called out, asking who was there, and the voices stopped immediately. I got dressed quickly and grabbed my radio and my bear spray and opened the door. My flashlight showed the small clearing around the cabin, trees on all sides, nothing moving. I walked around the entire cabin, checking for signs of people, but found nothing. No footprints in the dirt, no trash, no evidence anyone had been there. I went back inside and tried the radio, but this deep in the forest, I couldn't get a signal. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat on the cot with my flashlight and my knife and watched the door until sunrise. When it got light, I searched the area around the cabin more carefully. About 20 feet from the door, I found them, barefoot human footprints in a patch of soft dirt. There were multiple sets, maybe 4 or 5 different people, all barefoot. The prints circled the cabin and then led off into the forest, heading north. I followed them for about 100 yards, but they disappeared on rocky ground. I took photos and marked the location on my GPS. Part of me wanted to hike out right then and report this, but I told myself it was probably just some hippie hikers camping illegally. Happens sometimes, people who want to get away from everything and don't follow the rules about designated campsites. I decided to continue my patrol and keep an eye out for any illegal camps. I spent that day hiking the trails around Timothy Lake, checking conditions and cleaning up some minor fallen branches. I saw 2 groups of day hikers and everything seemed normal. I got back to the cabin around 6 p.m. and made dinner. As it got dark, I started feeling anxious for some reason, like that feeling you get when you know someone's watching you. I kept looking out the window, but all I could see was darkness and trees. Around 10 p.m., I heard the voices again. This time they were farther away, coming from the forest to the north of the cabin. I couldn't make out words, but it sounded like multiple people talking and occasionally laughing. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside. The voices stopped as soon as I opened the door. I stood there in the dark, listening, but heard nothing except wind in the trees and my own breathing. I went back inside, wedged a chair under the door handle, and tried to sleep. Around midnight, I woke to scratching sounds on the cabin walls, slow, deliberate scratching, like fingernails on wood, moving around the outside of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and yelled that I was armed and they needed to identify themselves. The scratching stopped. I sat there with my flashlight pointed at the door until morning. When the sun came up, I inspected the cabin walls and found fresh scratch marks in the wood, dozens of them, like someone had been dragging their fingernails across the logs. The marks were at different heights, some at shoulder level and some lower down. I radioed headquarters as soon as I got to high ground around noon. I reported the voices and footprints and scratch marks, and requested backup or permission to come out early. The dispatcher told me to stay put. They were sending another ranger named Michelle to meet me, and we'd investigate together. She'd arrive the next day. I spent that afternoon feeling relieved that I wouldn't be alone anymore. Michelle arrived around 3 p.m. the next day, hiking in from the main trailhead. She was in her 40s, tough and experienced, and she'd brought extra supplies, including a better radio. I showed her the scratch marks and the photos of the footprints and told her everything. She took it seriously, which made me feel better. She said she'd heard rumors about weird stuff happening in this area, but never anything confirmed. We made dinner together and discussed a plan. We'd take turns staying awake through the night, and if anything happened, we'd radio it in immediately and hike out at first light if necessary. Michelle took first watch while I tried to sleep. I was exhausted from 2 nights of barely sleeping, and I passed out almost immediately. I woke up to Michelle shaking my shoulder roughly. It was 1:30 a.m., and she looked terrified. She whispered that something was outside. We could both hear it now, not voices this time, but movement, multiple footsteps circling the cabin, slowly and deliberately. Then the scratching started again all around the cabin simultaneously, like 10 people were all scratching at once. Michelle tried the radio but got only static. We stood in the center of the cabin with our flashlights and bear spray ready. The scratching continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped. In the silence that followed, we heard breathing, heavy breathing, right outside the door. Then a voice spoke. It sounded human, but wrong somehow. The pitch was off and the words were slurred. It said, "We know you're inside," and then laughed. Michelle and I looked at each other, and I could see she was as scared as I was. More voices joined in, all talking at once, saying things like, "Come out and play," and "We've been waiting for you," and other phrases that didn't quite make sense. This continued for hours, voices talking and laughing and sometimes singing, in that wrong-sounding way. We didn't sleep, we just sat back to back in the center of the cabin and waited for sunrise. When the first light appeared through the window, the voices stopped abruptly. We waited another 30 minutes until it was fully light, then cautiously opened the door. The clearing was empty, but the ground around the cabin was covered in footprints, dozens of barefoot prints, all overlapping each other. We packed our gear as fast as we could and started hiking out. We made it maybe 2 miles when Michelle stopped suddenly. She was looking at something on the trail ahead. I came up beside her and saw them, 5 people standing on the trail about 50 feet ahead, blocking our path. They were all barefoot and wearing dirty, torn clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. Their skin was pale, almost gray, and their hair was long and matted. But their eyes were the worst part, completely black from edge to edge, like shark eyes. They stood there motionless, just staring at us. Michelle grabbed my arm, and we slowly backed away. The people on the trail started walking toward us, matching our pace. We turned and ran back the way we'd come. Behind us, we could hear them chasing, their bare feet slapping on the trail. We ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they'd give out. When we finally stopped to look back, they were gone. We were near the cabin again, so we grabbed our packs from inside and tried a different trail, heading east. This trail was rougher and saw less use, but it would eventually connect to a logging road where we could get a vehicle signal. We hiked as fast as we could, practically jogging, looking over our shoulders constantly. Around noon, we heard them again, voices in the forest on both sides of the trail, keeping pace with us but staying out of sight. They were hurting us, I realized. Every time we tried to change direction or leave the trail, the voices would get louder from that direction, pushing us back. They were driving us somewhere specific. The trail led into a narrow canyon with steep walls on both sides. As we entered the canyon, I knew we'd made a mistake. This was where they wanted us. At the far end of the canyon, maybe 200 yards ahead, we could see them, at least 20 people, all standing shoulder to shoulder, blocking the exit. Behind us, more appeared, cutting off our retreat. We were trapped. Michelle tried the radio again and, miraculously, got a weak signal. She screamed our location and that we needed immediate help. Then the radio died. The people started walking toward us from both ends, slowly and deliberately. Michelle and I climbed up the canyon wall, trying to find a way out, but the rock was too steep and loose. We were maybe 15 feet up when I slipped and fell hard onto the trail. Pain shot through my ankle and I knew I'd sprained it badly. Michelle climbed down to help me up. The people were closing in from both sides now. Then we heard the helicopter. A Forest Service chopper appeared over the canyon ridge, probably responding to Michelle's distress call. The helicopter was loud and low, and the downdraft kicked up dust and leaves. The people stopped advancing and looked up at the helicopter. Then they scattered, running into the forest on both sides of the canyon and disappearing into the trees within seconds. The helicopter landed in a wider part of the canyon, and we ran to it. The pilot and a paramedic pulled us aboard, and we lifted off immediately. From the air, we could see figures moving through the forest below, dozens of them, all heading deeper into the wilderness, away from any trails. Back at headquarters, we gave statements to Forest Service investigators and local police. They sent search teams into the canyon and the area around the cabin. The teams found the footprints and the scratch marks, and evidence of multiple people camping in the deep forest with no proper gear. They found fire pits and trash, and what looked like sleeping areas under fallen logs. But they never found any of the people. The official report said we'd encountered a group of illegal campers, possibly a cult, or a group of disturbed individuals living off the grid, and they'd become territorial and aggressive. The Forest Service closed several trails in that area and increased patrols. But I know it's more than that. I did research after I recovered and found reports going back decades. Hikers reporting voices in the forest, seeing pale people watching them from the trees, finding strange camps with no identifying information. At least 15 people have gone missing in that section of Mount Hood National Forest since 1975, and none of them were ever found. The Warm Springs tribes, who are indigenous to this area, have stories about forest spirits that steal people who wander too far from the paths. They say some spirits were once human, but lived in the forest so long they became something else, something that belongs to the wilderness now and doesn't want to leave. I think that's what we encountered. People who went into the forest years or decades ago and never came back, who adapted to living wild and lost their humanity in the process. Maybe they were hikers who got lost and went crazy from isolation. Maybe they choose to stay out there. Whatever the truth is, they're still in those woods, and they're dangerous. I transferred to a desk job in Portland, and I'll never do backcountry patrol again. Michelle did the same. She works in the permit office now. We don't talk about what happened, because the Forest Service made it clear they don't want us spreading panic. But I'm telling you now because people need to know. If you hike in Mount Hood National Forest, especially in the remote areas east of the mountain, and you hear voices in the forest that don't sound quite right, get out immediately. Don't investigate, don't try to find the source. Just leave as fast as you can. If you see people watching you from the trees, and they have those black shark eyes, run. Don't camp alone in the backcountry, and don't stray off marked trails. The forest is beautiful, but there are things living deep in those trees that used to be human and aren't anymore. They know the woods better than any ranger, and if they decide they want you, there's nowhere to hide. I still have nightmares about being trapped in that canyon, with them closing in from both sides. I wake up hearing that wrong-sounding laughter, and those voices saying, "Come out and play." My ankle healed, but I walk with a slight limp now, and every time it aches I remember running for my life through those trees. I'll never go back to Mount Hood. I'll never spend another night alone in any forest. Some places look empty, but they're not. And some things that live in the wild don't want to be found until they're ready to find you. Story 02. The abandoned mining tunnel near Britannia Beach, British Columbia. My grandfather immigrated to Canada from Poland in 1952 and got a job at the Britannia copper mine, north of Vancouver. He worked there for 18 years until the mine closed in 1974, and what he saw in his last week underground made him refuse to ever talk about mining again. He died in 2019, and in his final days, he finally told me and my mom what happened. I'm sharing this because people need to know why certain areas around the old Britannia mine are fenced off and marked with warnings that don't explain what the actual danger is. The Britannia mine was one of the largest copper mines in the British Empire, producing ore from 1905 until 1974. At its peak, over 60,000 people worked there. The mine tunnels extended deep into the mountain, over 100 miles of passages, going down thousands of feet below sea level. My grandfather, his name was Joseph, worked as a shaft supervisor, managing crews that drilled and blasted new tunnels. In October 1974, the mine was struggling financially, and they were planning to close operations within months. Joseph's crew was doing final assessments of the lower tunnels to see if there were any remaining or deposits worth extracting. On October 23rd, Joseph and 4 other men, Pete, Harold, Dimitri, and a young guy named Kevin, who'd only been working there 3 months, descended to level 42, which was one of the deepest sections of the mine, about 3,000 feet underground. Their job was to survey a section of tunnel that had been closed off since the 1930s due to flooding. The water had been pumped out months earlier, and management wanted to know if it was worth reopening that section. The tunnel entrance had been sealed with concrete back in 1938, but someone had jackhammered through it. Joseph said the air coming from the old tunnel was strange, cold and damp, with a smell like rotten eggs, which usually meant sulfur deposits. They had their helmets with carbide lamps, safety equipment, survey tools, and a radio to communicate with the surface, though reception was spotty that deep. They entered the old tunnel and immediately noticed it was different from the newer sections. The walls were rougher, hand-carved instead of machine-drilled, and there were old wooden support beams that looked ready to collapse. The floor was uneven and covered in puddles of dark water. They walked single file with Joseph in the lead. After about 200 feet, they found the first body. It was lying face down in the water, wearing old mining clothes that looked like they were from the 1930s. The body was mummified. The dry, cold air of the sealed tunnel had preserved it. Joseph radioed the surface to report it, but got only static in response. Pete suggested they head back, but Dimitri pointed out there might be more bodies, and they should do a full check before reporting to management. They continued forward and found 3 more bodies over the next 100 feet, all wearing old work clothes, all lying in positions that suggested they'd been running toward the exit when they collapsed. Kevin was getting spooked and wanted to turn back, but Joseph decided they should reach the end of this section to see what had killed these men. Maybe a gas leak or a collapse that trapped them. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, maybe 40 feet across, that looked like it had been a working area with old equipment scattered around. Rusty or carts, broken tools, and rotted timber. In the center of the chamber was a shaft, going straight down into darkness. There was no safety railing around it, just a hole about 8 feet across, dropping into nothing. Joseph approached the edge carefully and shined his lamp down, but the light didn't reach the bottom. He dropped a rock and they counted 1, 2, 3 for seconds before they heard it hit bottom. That meant the shaft went down at least 200 feet. Around the edges of the shaft were more bodies, maybe 10 of them, all arranged in a circle facing the hole. Unlike the other bodies, these ones were positioned deliberately, sitting upright with their hands on their knees. Joseph said their faces were intact enough to see their expressions, and they all looked terrified, mouths open like they died screaming. On the wall behind the bodies, someone had carved words into the stone. Joseph couldn't read all of it because his English wasn't perfect back then, but he made out words like "IT speaks," "don't listen," and "they come up at night." Harold took photos with his camera, and they all agreed this was way beyond their job description. They needed to get management and probably police down here. As they turned to leave, they heard the sound. It came from the shaft, a grinding, scraping sound, like metal on stone, rhythmic and slow. They all stopped and listened. The sound continued for maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. Then they heard voices, multiple voices, echoing up from the shaft, speaking in a language none of them recognized. The voices overlapped each other, creating this horrible chorus that made Joseph's teeth ache and gave him an instant headache. Kevin started backing away toward the tunnel entrance, and the rest of them followed. The voices got louder, and now there was another sound mixed in, footsteps or something like footsteps coming up the shaft. Joseph shouted for everyone to run, and they did. They ran back through the tunnel, splashing through the puddles and dodging the old support beams. Behind them, the voices were getting closer, and Joseph could hear things emerging from the chamber. Multiple things moving fast. Kevin was in the rear, and he was screaming. Joseph looked back and saw shadows moving in the darkness behind Kevin's lamp, shapes that didn't look quite human. Then Kevin's lamp went out, and he screamed once more and went silent. The 4 remaining men kept running. Dimitri slipped on the wet floor and fell hard, and Pete stopped to help him up. Joseph and Harold were ahead, and they heard Pete yell something, and then his voice cut off abruptly. Joseph and Harold didn't stop. They ran until they reached the concrete barrier at the tunnel entrance, squeezed through, and kept running until they reached the elevator shaft. They rode the elevator up to the surface in silence, both of them shaking and covered in cold sweat. At the surface, they reported what happened to the mine supervisor, who immediately called the police and organized a rescue team. 12 men went down, including police and experienced miners, with proper lights and equipment. They found the old tunnel and the chamber with the shaft, and the bodies arranged in a circle, exactly as Joseph described. They found Kevin's body at the entrance to the chamber, his neck broken in a way that suggested he'd been twisted around backward. They never found Pete or Dimitri. The shaft in the chamber floor was explored with ropes and lights, and they discovered it went down 300 feet and connected to a whole network of older tunnels that weren't on any official mine maps. These tunnels were ancient, hand-carved into the rock, possibly hundreds of years before the mine was established. The police theory was that indigenous people had dug them long ago, maybe as ceremonial sites. Down in those tunnels, they found more bodies, dozens of them, miners from different eras dating back to the early 1900s and possibly earlier. Some of the bodies showed signs of violence, broken bones and crushed skulls, but many had no obvious cause of death. The mining company sealed the entire section with concrete and steel, and the official report said there had been a structural collapse that killed 3 workers. Joseph and Harold were paid significant compensation on the condition they signed agreements never to discuss what really happened. The mine closed completely 6 weeks later. Joseph said he and Harold stayed in touch for years, and they both had the same recurring nightmare. They'd dream about standing at the edge of that shaft and hearing the voices calling up from below, and in the dream they'd understand what the voices were saying. The voices were inviting them to come down and join them. Harold killed himself in 1989, jumped off the Lions Gate Bridge, and his suicide note mentioned he couldn't stop hearing the voices. Joseph moved away from Britannia Beach and never went near the old mine again. He said some places in the earth were never meant to be disturbed, and the old miners had dug into something that existed long before humans arrived in British Columbia. The local indigenous peoples, the Squamish Nation, had legends about that mountain. They called it a place where spirits dwelled, and they never built permanent settlements there. The mining company ignored those warnings and paid the price. I visited the old Britannia mine site last year. It's a museum now that tourists can visit. They give tours of some of the upper tunnels and explain the history of copper mining. But there are whole sections of the mountain that are sealed off with chain link fences and warning signs. The signs say danger, unstable ground, but Joseph told me the real reason those areas are off limits. The company sealed the entrances, but they couldn't seal all the cracks and passages that connect to the deeper tunnels. Joseph said sometimes hikers disappear in the mountains around Britannia Beach, and search parties never find any trace of them. He said the things in those deep tunnels can come up through cracks, and they're still hungry. Before Joseph died, he made me promise never to go hiking alone near Britannia Beach, and never to explore any abandoned mining tunnels anywhere in British Columbia. He said there are dozens of old mines throughout the province, and many of them go deeper than official records show, connecting to things that were there before the mines. His last words to me were in Polish, but my mom translated. He said, "The mountain remembers everyone who disturbed it, and it's still collecting payment." I keep thinking about those voices Harold and Joseph heard coming up from the shaft, and I wonder if Harold finally went to join them in 1989. I wonder if Joseph heard them calling in his final days. Sometimes I wake up at 3 a.m. from dreams I can't quite remember, and I have this feeling like something was calling my name from far away, from somewhere deep underground. I've never been to Britannia Beach, and after what Joseph told me, I never will. If you're in British Columbia, and you see an old mining tunnel or an unmarked shaft in the mountains, don't go near it. Don't look inside, and definitely don't listen if you hear voices. Just turn around and leave as fast as you can. Some darkness goes deeper than any mine shaft, and some things down there have been waiting a very long time for someone to open the door again. Story number 4. The utility tunnel under Seattle Children's Hospital. There are places in this world where children's laughter should bring joy, but sometimes, in the wrong places, at the wrong hour, that sound becomes the most terrifying thing you'll ever hear. I learned this truth working night security at one of Seattle's most respected medical facilities, where the crying of children echoes through tunnels that shouldn't have any children in them at all. What I discovered beneath Seattle Children's Hospital didn't just cost me my job, it cost me my peace of mind forever. And if you have a child being treated there right now, you need to hear what I'm about to tell you. I worked security at Seattle Children's Hospital from 2018 to 2021, and I quit after what I experienced in the utility tunnels. I'm using a throwaway account because I signed an NDA when I left, but I feel like people should know about this, especially families who have kids receiving treatment there. The hospital is a huge complex on Sandpoint Way, with multiple buildings connected by both above-ground skywalks and underground utility tunnels. Most people, even staff who've worked there for years, don't know the full extent of what lies beneath the hospital. The tunnel system is massive, far larger than necessary for a facility of this size, and some sections date back to construction projects that were never fully documented. The utility tunnels carry steam pipes, electrical conduits, water lines, and other infrastructure between buildings. They're off-limits to everyone except maintenance staff and security personnel. Most of the tunnels are narrow concrete corridors, maybe 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, lit by fluorescent lights spaced every 30 feet. Some sections are older and have exposed brick walls and worse lighting. The temperature down there varies wildly. Some areas are sweltering hot from the steam pipes, while others are cold enough to see your breath. The air always smells like a mixture of dust, mildew, and that particular hospital smell of disinfectant that never quite covers up the underlying scent of sickness. My job on night shift was to patrol the entire campus, including the tunnels, which I had to walk through twice per shift at midnight and 4 a.m. The hospital never closed. There were always doctors and nurses working and sick kids in beds, but the tunnels were usually empty at night except for the occasional maintenance guy. I'd start at the main security office, grab my flashlight and radio, and descend through the access door near the loading dock. The door was heavy steel and always felt cold to the touch, even in summer. Once you were down there, the sounds of the hospital above faded to a distant hum, and you were alone with the dripping pipes and the buzzing lights. For my first year, everything was normal. The tunnels were creepy, sure, but nothing worse than any other basement corridor. I'd walk the routes, check that all the maintenance doors were locked, make notes about any leaking pipes or burnt-out lights, and head back to the surface. Some nights I'd see a maintenance worker and we'd nod to each other. Most nights I saw nobody. I'd listen to podcasts through my earbuds to make the time pass faster and to cover up the unsettling sounds of the old building settling and the pipes clanking. Then, in March 2019, things started getting weird. I was doing my midnight patrol, walking through the main tunnel that runs from the main hospital building to the research building, when I heard a child crying. At first, I thought maybe the sound was carrying from one of the pediatric wards above. The ventilation system connected everything, and sometimes you could hear muffled sounds from the floors above. But as I walked further, the crying got louder and clearer. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me, deeper in the tunnel. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but the crying continued, a sound of pure distress that made my chest tighten. I walked forward, and the sound seemed to be coming from behind a locked maintenance door. I tried my key, but that door required a different clearance level I didn't have. The crying continued on the other side of the door, rising and falling in waves. I radioed the other security guard on duty, a guy named Marcus, who'd been working at the hospital for 5 years. He was a big guy, former military, not someone who spooked easily. I told him what I heard, and he said he'd come down with the maintenance master key. While I waited, the crying stopped suddenly, cut off mid-sob like someone had flipped a switch. Marcus arrived 10 minutes later, and we opened the door together. Behind it was a smaller side tunnel that I'd never been in before. The lights were off, and our flashlights showed it was maybe 50 feet long, ending in a brick wall. The tunnel was empty, nobody there, but we could both hear the crying now, and it sounded like it was coming from the walls themselves. The sound seemed to move, starting from one side and traveling to the other, like someone was walking through the walls. Marcus said it was probably pipes resonating, or some acoustic trick from the ventilation system. We checked and didn't find any kids, obviously, so we locked it back up and reported it in our log. But I heard that crying 3 more times over the next month, always in different sections of the tunnel, always coming from behind locked doors or from areas that were supposed to be empty. Other security guards reported hearing it, too. A woman named Paula, who worked the weekend nights, said she'd heard it 5 times in 2 weeks. Another guard named Tom said he'd heard what sounded like multiple children crying at once. Management said it was probably sound carrying from the pediatric wards above through the ventilation shafts, and told us to stop putting it in our reports because it was scaring the new staff. They said we were creating an atmosphere of fear that was affecting morale. In June 2019, I was doing my 4 a.m. patrol alone because we were short-staffed. Marcus had called in sick, and they couldn't find coverage, so I was solo that night. I was in one of the older sections of tunnel, an area under the original hospital building from the 1950s. This section had brick walls and older lights, and the ceiling was lower. The bricks were stained with years of water seepage, and, in some places, you could see where repairs had been made with newer concrete. I was walking through when all the lights went out at once. Complete darkness, the kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face. My flashlight was in my belt, so I grabbed it, but before I could turn it on, I heard footsteps running toward me in the darkness. Small footsteps like a child running, the slap of bare feet on concrete. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking as I fumbled with my flashlight and got it on. just as something rushed past me so close I felt the air move and smelled something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a vase. My light caught a glimpse of a small figure in a hospital gown running away down the tunnel. I shouted for them to stop, concerned that a patient had somehow gotten down here and was lost. I ran after them, my boots echoing off the brick walls. The figure was fast, impossibly fast for a small child, and I couldn't catch up. They turned a corner, and when I rounded it seconds later, the tunnel was empty. Dead end, brick wall, nowhere they could have gone. The lights came back on suddenly, the fluorescence flickering and buzzing. I stood there breathing hard, my flashlight beam shaking in my trembling hand. I radioed for backup. 3 other guards came down and we searched that entire section, checked every door and every side passage. We found nothing, no child, no footprints, nothing. But I know what I saw. The other guards looked at me like I was losing it, but Paula pulled me aside and said she believed me because she'd seen something similar the week before. She just hadn't reported it because she was afraid of being laughed at or fired. After that incident, I requested to be taken off tunnel patrol, but my supervisor denied it, saying I was one of the most experienced guards and they needed me on that route. He did say I could take a partner with me, though. For the next few months, I did tunnel patrols with Marcus or other guards, and we'd occasionally hear the crying or see shadows moving at the edge of our flashlight beams. But nothing as direct as what I'd experienced. We developed a system of staying close together and constantly checking behind us. Marcus started carrying a camera to try to document anything unusual, but the camera never seemed to work properly in the tunnels. The photos would come out blurred or completely black, even with the flash on. Then, in October 2019, a maintenance worker named Jerry went missing during his night shift. Jerry was a quiet guy in his 50s who'd worked at the hospital for 20 years. He knew those tunnels better than anyone. He'd radioed, saying he was going into the tunnels to check on a steam leak in Section D, one of the oldest areas. He never came back. They found his tools and his radio in one of the older tunnel sections, but no sign of Jerry. His tools were scattered, like he'd dropped them suddenly, and his radio was still on, hissing with static. Police investigated, searched the entire tunnel system with dogs, checked camera footage. The cameras in the tunnels where Jerry disappeared had mysteriously malfunctioned that night, just static on the recordings. The dogs acted strangely in that section, whining and pulling away, refusing to go further down certain passages. Jerry was never found. The police eventually ruled it a voluntary disappearance, said maybe Jerry had personal problems and walked off the job, but everyone who worked at the hospital knew better. Jerry loved his job and his family. He wasn't the type to just disappear. After Jerry disappeared, the hospital administration hired contractors to install new cameras throughout the tunnel system, proper, modern cameras with night vision and motion detection. They also installed new locks on all the maintenance doors and created a new policy that nobody went into the tunnels alone for any reason. They brought in some kind of consultant who spent 3 days mapping the entire tunnel system and taking readings with equipment I didn't understand. I felt safer with the new cameras until I saw what they recorded. It was December 2019, and I was in the security office reviewing footage from the previous night, because there had been a reported theft from one of the storage rooms. I was scrubbing through hours of empty tunnel footage when I saw movement in one of the older sections. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m. A child walked into frame from a side passage that was supposed to be locked. The child looked maybe 8 years old, wearing a hospital gown, barefoot, walking slowly down the center of the tunnel. The gate was wrong somehow, too smooth, like the child was gliding more than walking. I watched as the child walked out of frame toward the main hospital building. I checked the next camera, and the child appeared again, still walking in the same direction. I followed the child's progress through 6 different cameras until they reached a junction near the central mechanical room. At that junction, the child stopped and turned to look directly at the camera. The face was wrong, pale and blurred, like an old photograph with dark, empty spaces where the eyes should be. The child smiled, and it was the worst smile I've ever seen. Too wide, and with too many teeth, stretching impossibly across the face. Then the child walked out of frame toward the mechanical room. I immediately radioed the guard who'd been on duty that night, Paula. She said she hadn't seen anything unusual on her patrol. I showed her the footage and she went pale, her hands shaking as she watched the screen. We reviewed all the camera feeds from that night and found the child appearing on 12 different cameras over a 2-hour period, always walking slowly through the tunnels, sometimes stopping to look at the cameras with that terrible smile. The child never appeared on any camera near an entrance or exit. They just appeared in the tunnels and eventually disappeared in the same section where Jerry had vanished. I reported it to my supervisor and he watched the footage with 2 other administrators. They had a meeting and then called me in. They said the footage showed a technical glitch, probably a loop from old recorded footage that got mixed into the new feed. They said I should delete the files and not mention it to anyone because it would upset the staff and families. When I pointed out that we only installed these cameras 2 months ago, so there couldn't be old footage to loop, they didn't have an answer. I refused to delete it, so they did it themselves from the main server. They offered me a transfer to day shift, which I accepted immediately. I thought working days would be better, but knowing what was in those tunnels even during the day made me constantly anxious. I started having nightmares about being trapped in the tunnels with that child following me, its footsteps getting closer and closer while I ran through endless corridors that all looked the same. I'd wake up gasping, still feeling like I could hear those small feet padding behind me in the dark. In March 2021, another guard named David went missing during a night patrol. Same story, radioed saying he was checking something in the tunnels, never came back. They found his radio and his flashlight, but the cameras had malfunctioned again, just static. David was never found and police investigated but came up with nothing. His family put up missing person posters all over Seattle, but there were no leads, no sightings, nothing. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I quit 2 weeks after David disappeared. I couldn't do it anymore. During my exit interview, the HR director had me sign an expanded NDA that specifically mentioned I couldn't discuss anything related to the tunnels or any unusual incidents. They gave me a severance package that was way more generous than normal for a security guard, enough money to cover 6 months of expenses. I took the money and left. I tried to forget about it and move on with my life, but I can't stop thinking about those kids or whatever they are. I did some research and found out the hospital was built on land that used to be a naval station during World War II. Before that, it was empty land, but there are records of a children's home operating nearby in the early 1900s that burned down, killing 17 kids. Some people say the hospital's underground tunnels were built on top of the old children's home foundation. I also found forum posts from other former hospital employees talking about strange experiences in the tunnels. Hearing children crying, seeing figures in hospital gowns, equipment moving by itself. One former nurse said she heard stories from older staff about a patient who died in the 1960s, a child who got lost in the tunnels during construction and wasn't found for 3 days and died of exposure. She said after that child died, staff started reporting hauntings. I don't know what's true and what's legend, but I know what I saw on those cameras, and I know 2 men disappeared in those tunnels and were never found. I think something is down there, maybe the ghosts of dead children or something worse, and they don't want to be alone. They take people sometimes, and those people never come back. If you have a child receiving treatment at Seattle Children's Hospital, they're in good hands medically, but don't let your kid wander off, and definitely don't let them go near any doors marked authorized personnel only or utility access. And if your kid talks about seeing other children in hospital gowns appearing in their room at night or hearing voices coming from the vents, believe them. Get them out of that hospital as fast as you can. I still live in Seattle, but I won't drive past that hospital. I take a longer route to avoid it because even seeing the buildings from the street makes me feel sick. Sometimes I wake up at 3 a.m. from nightmares where I'm back in those tunnels and I can hear children crying all around me, and I know they're getting closer. I moved to a 3rd-floor apartment because I don't want a basement and I sleep with lights on. People think I'm paranoid, but they didn't see what I saw. They don't know what's underneath that hospital waiting in the dark. The hospital is still operating and they still have guards patrolling those tunnels at night. I wonder how many more people will disappear before someone finally believes those tunnels need to be sealed permanently. I wonder if the things down there will ever be satisfied or if they'll just keep taking people forever. Last week, I saw a news article about another maintenance worker who went missing at the hospital. The article said he probably just quit without notice, but I know better. I know he's down there somewhere in those tunnels and he's never coming back. And neither is anyone else who gets taken by whatever waits in the darkness beneath Seattle Children's Hospital. 5th narration. The hydroelectric tunnel under Snoqualmie Falls. I worked for Puget Sound Energy as an electrical engineer for 9 years, and I was part of the team that maintained the hydroelectric plant inside Snoqualmie Falls. Most people who visit the falls don't know there's a massive power plant carved into the rock behind the waterfall that's been generating electricity since 1898. There's a whole network of tunnels and chambers inside the cliff, and I spent hundreds of hours down there doing inspections and repairs. What I found in the abandoned section in January 2020 made me quit my job, and I haven't been back to Snoqualmie Falls since. My name is Jennifer Park, and I'm 36 years old. I loved my job because it combined my interest in engineering with working in a historic facility that most people never get to see. The plant is incredible. They carved huge chambers out of solid rock over 100 years ago and installed massive turbines that still run today. There are 2 plants actually, Plant 1 from 1898 and Plant 2 from 1910, connected by tunnels that run through the mountain. Access to the plants is through a tunnel entrance at the base of the falls that's locked and secured. Only authorized personnel can enter. The tunnels are well lit and maintained in the active sections, but there are older abandoned sections from the original construction that were sealed off decades ago. In January 2020, we had a problem with one of the water intake tunnels. Pressure sensors were showing fluctuations that didn't match the normal patterns, and my supervisor Dave asked me and a technician named Marcus to investigate. We thought maybe there was a blockage or a crack in the tunnel wall allowing water to leak into spaces it shouldn't be. We entered through the main access tunnel and made our way to the intake area. The intake tunnels are large pipes that bring water from above the falls down to the turbines. They're about 8 feet in diameter, and you can walk through them when the water is diverted, but it's loud because you can hear the falls thundering nearby. We found the problem area. There was definitely water leaking through the wall, but it was coming from behind a section of the tunnel that backed up against one of the old abandoned areas. Dave said we needed to access the abandoned section to see if there was structural damage. He gave us a key to one of the sealed doors and told us to be careful because that area hadn't been inspected in over 20 years. Marcus and I found the sealed door. It was steel with multiple padlocks covered in rust. We used bolt cutters on the old locks and pulled the door open. The air that came out was stale and damp and smelled like mold and something else, something organic and rotten. Our flashlights showed a tunnel carved roughly from rock, much cruder than the maintained sections. This was from the original 1890s construction before they had modern equipment. The walls were uneven and water dripped from the ceiling. We stepped inside and Marcus pulled the door partly closed behind us but didn't lock it so we could get back out easily. The tunnel extended about 50 feet and opened into a larger chamber. This chamber had been carved out during the initial construction and then abandoned when they realized they dug in the wrong direction. Our lights showed old equipment scattered around, rusted tools and broken wheelbarrows and rotted timber supports. The floor was covered in about 2 inches of water that had leaked in from somewhere. We waded through looking for the source of the leak into the active tunnel. That's when we found the other door. It was at the far end of the chamber, another steel door, but this one looked newer, maybe from the 1950s or 60s, and it was ajar. This door wasn't on any of the plans I'd studied. Marcus and I looked at each other, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. Why would there be a sealed door leading from an abandoned section to somewhere else? We should have radioed Dave right then, but curiosity got the better of us. We opened the door wider and shined our lights through. Beyond was another tunnel, even older looking, with walls that appeared to be hand-carved. This tunnel sloped downward steeply and our lights couldn't reach the end. I could hear water running somewhere below. Not the roar of the falls, but something else. An underground stream, maybe. Marcus said we should mark this and report it, but I wanted to see where it led. I told myself we'd just go down 50 feet and check it out. We started down the slope carefully because the floor was wet and slippery. The temperature dropped noticeably and our breath started showing in our flashlight beams. After about 100 feet, the tunnel leveled out and we found ourselves in a natural cave system. This wasn't construction. This was a natural cavern that must have existed long before the power plant. The construction crews had accidentally broken through into it. The cavern was large, maybe 60 feet across, with a high ceiling that our lights couldn't reach. There were rock formations, stalagmites and stalactites, and pools of dark water scattered across the floor. It was beautiful in a creepy way. Marcus pointed out that there were footprints in the mud near one of the pools. We examined them and they were definitely human boot prints, and they looked relatively recent, not decades old. Someone had been down here. We followed the footprints deeper into the cavern, and they led to another passage. This passage had more evidence of human activity. There were markings on the walls made with chalk or white paint, arrows and numbers and words we couldn't read in the dim light. We followed the passage for maybe 10 minutes, and it opened into another chamber. This chamber had been modified by humans. There were concrete pillars supporting the ceiling and electrical conduits running along the walls. The conduits were old, the wiring exposed and corroded. In the center of the chamber was equipment, old generators and switchboards and control panels that looked like they were from the 1940s or 50s. This must have been some kind of auxiliary power station or backup facility that was built and then abandoned. Marcus took photos while I examined the equipment. Most of it was rusted and non-functional, but one of the control panels had gauges that still showed readings. According to the panel, there was still electrical current running through some of these systems, which didn't make sense if this area had been abandoned for 70 years. Then we heard the generator. It started suddenly with a deep rumbling that made the whole chamber vibrate. One of the old generators in the corner had turned on by itself. Its diesel engine was running, and the generator was producing power because lights started flickering on throughout the chamber. Old fluorescent lights hanging from the ceiling buzzed to life, casting a harsh white light. Marcus and I stood there frozen as the lights revealed more of the chamber. There was more equipment than we'd initially seen, banks of machinery and control stations and what looked like monitoring equipment. And there were papers scattered on one of the control stations, documents and notebooks that looked more recent. I walked over and picked up one of the notebooks. It was a logbook with entries dated from 2019, just months ago. The entries were in neat handwriting and described electrical readings and equipment maintenance and tunnel inspections. Someone had been working down here recently. The most recent entry was dated 3 weeks ago. Marcus called my name and pointed to something in the far corner of the chamber. There was a sleeping bag and camping equipment and food supplies. Someone was living down here. We heard footsteps then, coming from one of the other passages leading out of this chamber. Heavy boots on stone getting closer. We shut off our flashlights and hid behind some of the equipment. The footsteps entered the chamber and stopped. Through a gap in the machinery, I could see a man, maybe 50 years old, wearing dirty coveralls and carrying a toolbox. He walked to the control station and set down the toolbox and started checking the gauges. He was humming to himself like this was completely normal. Marcus and I stayed hidden and quiet. The man worked for maybe 5 minutes, then pulled a sandwich from his pocket and sat down on a stool to eat. As he ate, he talked to himself or maybe to someone we couldn't see. He said things like, "Pressure holding steady," and "everything running smooth," and "they'll never find it." After he finished eating, he picked up his toolbox and walked to another passage and disappeared. We waited until we couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, then came out from hiding. We needed to leave immediately and report this. We started back the way we'd come, but Marcus stopped suddenly. He pointed to something on the wall we'd missed before. There was a map, a detailed hand-drawn map of what looked like an extensive tunnel system. The map showed the power plant tunnels we knew about, but also dozens of other passages branching off in all directions. Some tunnels were marked with labels like storage and access shaft and river connection. One tunnel was marked residence, and another was marked observation post. This wasn't just an abandoned section. This was an entire underground facility that someone had been maintaining and using. We took photos of the map and then ran back through the passages toward the power plant. We climbed the slope to the abandoned chamber and reached the door to the active section. That's when we heard the generator shut off behind us and heard footsteps running up the slope. Someone was chasing us. We burst through the door and slammed it shut, and Marcus held it while I radioed Dave. I was talking fast, telling him we needed security immediately because there was someone unauthorized in the abandoned section. Dave said he was coming with security and to get to the main access tunnel. We ran through the active tunnels and reached the entrance just as Dave arrived with 2 security guards. We told them everything and showed them the photos. Dave looked at the photos and his face went pale. He made some phone calls on his radio using codes I didn't understand. Within 30 minutes, there were more people arriving, not just power company security, but what looked like federal agents. They set up a perimeter around the tunnel entrance and a team of agents went inside in full tactical gear. Marcus and I had to give statements to the agents and they took our phones and cameras. They asked us detailed questions about exactly what we'd seen and who we'd seen. They were especially interested in the man in the coveralls and the map. They kept us there for 6 hours while teams searched the tunnels. When they finally let us leave, they made us sign non-disclosure agreements and told us we couldn't discuss anything we'd seen with anyone, including other power company employees. They said it was a matter of national security. Dave pulled me aside before I left and told me to take a few days off and that he'd have another engineer handle the leak repair. He looked shaken and wouldn't meet my eyes. I went home and tried to process what had happened. I researched the history of Snoqualmie Falls online and found some interesting things. During World War II, the power plant had been considered critical infrastructure, and there were rumors that the government had built secret backup facilities in case of attack. During the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s, the government built secret bunkers and command centers throughout the country, and many were hidden inside mountains or underground. I think we'd stumbled into one of those facilities, a secret bunker built into the mountain behind Snoqualmie Falls that had been maintained by someone long after it was officially abandoned. When I went back to work the following week, everything had changed. The door to the abandoned section had been welded shut and the area was marked off-limits. Dave wouldn't talk about what happened and Marcus had been transferred to a different facility. I tried to ask questions but was told firmly to drop it. A month later, I received a visit at my home from 2 federal agents. They reminded me of my NDA and said I needed to stop researching the history of the power plant online because I was accessing information I shouldn't be. They said for my own safety I should forget everything I'd seen, and if I discussed it with anyone I could face federal charges. I quit my job 2 weeks later because I couldn't work there knowing what was underneath and not being able to talk about it. I've kept quiet for over 3 years, but I can't anymore because people deserve to know. There's an entire secret facility under Snoqualmie Falls that's still active and maintained by someone. I don't know if it's the government or private individuals or something else, but it's there and it connects to the natural cave system under the mountain. The man we saw down there might have been a caretaker, or he might have been living there for other reasons. Maybe he was homeless and found access to the tunnels, or maybe he was put there by whoever built the facility. I don't know, and I'll probably never know because I'm never going back. What scares me most is the map we saw. If that map was accurate, there are tunnels extending for miles in every direction under that area. Some of those tunnels might connect to other buildings or facilities, or even to the surface in unexpected places. There could be dozens of people living in those tunnels, and we'd never know. Snoqualmie Falls is a popular tourist destination. Thousands of people visit every year to see the waterfall and take photos. They have no idea what's underneath their feet. No idea there's a whole world of tunnels and chambers and abandoned facilities down there. If you visit Snoqualmie Falls, stay on the marked paths and don't go near any fenced-off areas or locked doors. Don't go hiking in the forest around the falls looking for cave entrances. And if you work for the power company and you're asked to inspect the abandoned sections, refuse. Say you're sick or find any excuse not to go. Some things are abandoned for good reasons, and some secrets are kept because revealing them would be dangerous. I've never told anyone this story before except my husband, and he thought I was exaggerating or misremembering because of stress. But I have the photos still, backed up on a drive that I keep hidden. I have proof of what we found, even though I can't show it to anyone without risking federal charges. I'm sharing this anonymously because people need to know that there are places in the Pacific Northwest that aren't what they seem. There are tunnels and facilities that don't appear on any official maps, maintained by people who don't want to be found. And if you accidentally discover them like we did, powerful people will make sure you stay quiet. I don't know what that facility was originally built for, or why it's still being maintained, or who the man in the coveralls was working for. But I know it exists, and I know the government doesn't want people asking questions about it. Sometimes I drive past Snoqualmie Falls and I look at all the tourists taking selfies in front of the waterfall, and I want to warn them. I want to tell them that underneath that beautiful park there's a hidden world they can't imagine. But I don't, because I signed the papers and I don't want federal agents showing up at my house again. So I'm telling you instead, and you can decide what to believe. Just remember that the next time you visit a historic site or a national park or anywhere that's been around for over 100 years, there might be more underneath than you think. There might be tunnels and rooms and entire facilities that were built in secret and then forgotten by everyone except the people who still use them. And those people really don't want you to find them. Sixth narration. The abandoned psychiatric hospital tunnels under Vancouver. I'm an urban explorer from Vancouver, and I've been documenting abandoned buildings throughout British Columbia for 8 years on my YouTube channel. I've explored old factories, closed schools, empty hotels, and dozens of other forgotten places. I always respected the locations, never vandalized anything, and followed basic safety rules. What happened in the tunnels under Riverview Hospital in Coquitlam last October made me delete my entire channel and stop exploring completely. I'm posting this story because 3 other explorers have gone missing in that area in the past year, and the police aren't connecting the dots. My name is Alex Chun, and I'm 29 years old. Riverview Hospital was a massive psychiatric facility that opened in 1913 and operated for almost 100 years before closing most of its buildings in 2012. The site covers over 200 acres with dozens of buildings scattered across the property. Some buildings have been demolished, but many still stand empty and decaying. The place is famous among urban explorers because it's been used in tons of movies and TV shows, and it has this creepy abandoned asylum vibe that makes for great photos. The property is technically closed to the public and security patrols regularly, but explorers still find ways in. What most people don't know is that underneath Riverview, there's an extensive tunnel system connecting all the major buildings. These tunnels were built so staff could move between buildings during winter without going outside, and so they could transport patients discreetly. The tunnels also carried steam pipes for heating and electrical lines and water pipes. Some sections of the tunnel system are still used for utilities, but most have been abandoned for decades. I'd explored parts of the Riverview tunnels before and gotten some great footage, but I'd never accessed the oldest section that ran under the original West Lawn building. That building dated from 1913 and was the first structure built on the site. It had been closed since the 1980s and was in really bad shape with boarded windows and a roof that partially collapsed. Most explorers avoided it because it was too dangerous structurally. In October 2023, I was contacted through my YouTube channel by someone who called themselves River Explorer 99. They said they had information about an entrance to the deep tunnels under West Lawn that led to areas nobody had documented before. They said there were rooms down there that contained old medical records and equipment from the early days of the hospital. This was exactly the kind of discovery that would make for great content. River Explorer 99 sent me detailed directions to the entrance, which was apparently accessible through a maintenance building near the old powerhouse. We arranged to meet at the site on a Saturday night at 11 p.m. I brought my usual gear, my camera with night vision capability, backup batteries, 2 flashlights, my phone, water, and some energy bars. I also brought pepper spray because you never know who you might encounter in abandoned places. I arrived at the meeting point and waited for 30 minutes, but River Explorer 99 never showed. I texted them but got no response. I was annoyed because I'd driven an hour to get there, but since I was already on site, I decided to check out the entrance they described. I found the maintenance building exactly where they said it would be. The door was unlocked, which surprised me because security usually locked everything. Inside was a small room with old equipment and a floor hatch with a ladder leading down. This matched River Explorer 99's description perfectly. I should have been more suspicious about why they'd set up this meeting and then not showed up, but I was excited about the potential discovery. I opened the hatch and climbed down the ladder with my camera gear. The ladder went down about 15 feet into a narrow concrete corridor lit by a single failing fluorescent light. The air was damp and cold and smelled like mildew and something medicinal like old disinfectant. I could hear water dripping somewhere ahead and the distant hum of machinery. I started walking, filming everything with my camera. The corridor had pipes running along the ceiling and walls covered in peeling paint. After about 50 feet, I reached a junction where the corridor branched in 3 directions. There were old signs on the walls with arrows pointing to different buildings: West Lawn, East Lawn, Center Lawn, Crease Clinic. I chose the tunnel marked West Lawn because that was the oldest section. This tunnel was darker with no working lights, so I switched to my flashlight and the camera's night vision. The walls here were older, brick instead of concrete, and the ceiling was lower. I had to duck in some places where pipes hung down. The floor was uneven and had puddles of stagnant water. After maybe 10 minutes of walking, I reached a large metal door with a small window at eye level. The door was heavy steel and had a sign that said authorized personnel only, and below that restricted area. The door was slightly open. I pushed it wider and stepped through into a different kind of space. This wasn't a tunnel anymore. It was a corridor with rooms branching off on both sides. The rooms had heavy doors with small windows, and I realized this must have been part of the psychiatric hospital itself, an underground ward maybe for patients who needed to be isolated. I walked down the corridor slowly, shining my light into each room through the windows. Most rooms were empty except for old furniture, metal bed frames and chairs, and empty cabinets. Some rooms had restraints still attached to the beds, leather straps with buckles, and I felt sick thinking about patients being tied down here underground away from sunlight. At the end of the corridor was a larger room that looked like it had been a treatment area. There was an old electroshock therapy machine on a table and cabinets full of glass vials and syringes. I was filming all of this, my hands shaking slightly because this was incredible footage but also deeply disturbing. Then I heard a door slam somewhere behind me back in the corridor I just walked through. I spun around and called out asking if anyone was there. No response. I walked back down the corridor checking each room again. They were all empty. I reached the metal door I'd entered through and it was closed now. I tried the handle and it was locked from the other side. I pounded on the door and yelled but nobody answered. My phone had no signal down here, which I'd expected. I tried not to panic and think rationally. There had to be another way out. These old facilities always had multiple exits for safety. I went back down the corridor past the treatment room and found another door at the far end. This one opened into a stairwell going down. I didn't want to go deeper, but I had no choice. I descended the stairs carefully. They were metal and some steps were loose and rusted. The stairwell went down 2 levels and opened into another tunnel system, even older than the first. These tunnels had stone walls that looked hand-carved, and the ceiling was arched like something from a medieval dungeon. There were old electric lights mounted on the walls, but none were working. My flashlight beam showed the tunnel extending into darkness in both directions. I chose left randomly and started walking. The tunnel curved and branched multiple times, and I quickly lost any sense of direction. I tried to mark my path by scratching arrows on the walls with my keys, but the stone was too hard. After what felt like 30 minutes of walking, I came to a large chamber. This chamber was circular, maybe 40 feet across, with multiple tunnel entrances around the perimeter. In the center was a table, a modern folding table that looked completely out of place, and on the table were items that made my blood run cold. There were photos, printed photos spread across the table, and they were photos of me. Photos of me entering the maintenance building tonight, photos of me climbing down the ladder, photos of me walking through the tunnels. Someone had been following me and photographing me the entire time. Next to the photos was a laptop computer that was open and running. The screen showed a split view of multiple camera feeds, security cameras showing different parts of the tunnel system. I could see myself on one of the screens standing at the table. I spun around looking for the camera and found it mounted high on the wall behind me. Someone was watching me right now. I grabbed the laptop to see if I could figure out who was doing this. There were files on the desktop with names like subject_07, 12, and 19. I opened one and found photos and videos of other people in these tunnels, other explorers I assumed. Some of the footage showed people looking scared and lost, wandering through the tunnels, clearly unable to find their way out. One video showed a young woman crying and calling for help. Another showed a man running through a tunnel looking back over his shoulder at something chasing him. I heard footsteps then, multiple sets of footsteps, coming from several of the tunnel entrances around the chamber. I looked at the camera feeds on the laptop and saw figures in dark clothes entering the chamber from different directions, surrounding me. I ran for the nearest tunnel entrance, but someone stepped out, blocking my path. They were wearing all black with a ski mask covering their face. I turned to run another direction, but there were more of them, at least 6 people all dressed the same way, all moving toward me. I screamed and tried to push past one of them, but they grabbed my arm. Their grip was strong and I couldn't break free. Another one grabbed my other arm and they started dragging me toward one of the tunnel entrances. I fought and kicked and screamed, but nobody could hear me down here. They dragged me through the tunnel for maybe 5 minutes and then into a room. The room had a metal bed frame and restraints just like the ones I'd seen earlier. They pushed me down onto the bed and started strapping my wrists and ankles. I was crying and begging them to let me go, but they didn't speak. They just worked efficiently like they'd done this before. Once I was secured, they all stepped back and one of them pulled out a phone and took photos of me. Then they left the room and closed the door and I heard it lock. I was alone in the darkness, strapped to a bed in an underground room beneath an abandoned psychiatric hospital. I screamed until my voice gave out. I pulled against the restraints until my wrists bled, but they were too strong. Hours passed. I don't know how many because my phone was in my backpack, which they'd taken. I drifted in and out of consciousness from exhaustion and fear. At some point, the door opened and someone came in. They turned on a light, a battery-powered lantern, and I could see them clearly for the first time. It was a woman, maybe 40 years old, wearing normal clothes, not the black outfit the others had worn. She set the lantern on the floor and sat down on a chair in the corner. She said her name was Dr. Sarah Klein and she wanted to talk to me. I asked her to let me go and she said she would, but first she needed to explain something. She said she'd been a psychiatrist at Riverview Hospital until it closed and she'd specialized in studying fear responses and trauma. She said when the hospital closed, she couldn't continue her research through official channels, so she'd continued privately down here in the tunnels. She and her team had been monitoring urban explorers and other trespassers and selecting subjects for their studies. They'd bring people down here and put them through various fear-inducing scenarios while monitoring their responses. She said they'd been doing this for 3 years and had studied over 30 subjects. I asked what happened to the other subjects and she smiled and said most were eventually released with no memory of what happened because they were drugged. Some subjects reacted so badly that they had to be kept longer for observation. A few subjects had died during the experiments, heart attacks from extreme fear mostly, and those were buried in sealed sections of the tunnels. She said I was a good subject because I was calm enough to have a conversation, which meant I had strong stress tolerance. She wanted to keep me for a week and run a series of tests. I begged her to let me go, promised I wouldn't tell anyone, but she just shook her head. She said every subject promised that, and some of them kept the promise after being released, but some didn't. The ones who talked to police or posted online about their experiences had to be dealt with permanently. She couldn't risk me exposing their operation. She stood up and picked up the lantern and said someone would bring me food and water and the first test would begin in a few hours after I'd had time to rest. Then she left and locked the door and I was in darkness again. I don't know how long I was there. Time loses meaning in complete darkness. Someone did bring food eventually, just left it by the door and left without speaking. I couldn't reach it because of the restraints. The first test started when they played sounds through speakers in the room, recordings of screaming and crying and people begging for help. The sounds played for hours without stopping. Then they switched to other sounds, whispers in that strange language I couldn't understand, and scratching sounds like something trying to get into the room. I tried to stay calm and tell myself it was just recordings, but after hours of it, my mind started breaking down. I started seeing things in the darkness, shadows moving, faces appearing and disappearing. Then the door opened and someone came in wearing a mask that looked like a plague doctor with the long beak. They stood over me, not speaking, just staring down and breathing heavily. They stayed there for what felt like hours. After they left, I was shaking uncontrollably. The tests continued, I don't know for how long. Days maybe. They'd leave me alone for long periods, then suddenly flood the room with bright strobe lights and loud sirens. They'd inject me with something that made my heart race and gave me terrible anxiety. They'd whisper things through the speakers telling me nobody was coming to save me and I'd die down here like the others. I started losing my grip on reality. I couldn't tell what was real and what was hallucination. I saw my dead grandmother standing in the corner of the room. I heard my own voice coming from the speakers telling me to give up. At some point, I stopped fighting the restraints and just lay there waiting to die. Then the door opened and it was Dr. Klein again. She looked disappointed. She said I'd broken faster than expected, only 5 days, and I was no longer useful for their research. She said they'd have to dispose of me. I didn't even react to that, I was too far gone to care. She left and I heard voices outside the door discussing what to do with me. One voice said they should use the incinerator, another said just leave me in one of the sealed tunnels to die naturally. Then I heard different sounds, shouting and running and what sounded like police radios. The door burst open and there were police officers with flashlights and they were cutting the restraints. Someone was wrapping a blanket around me and carrying me. I couldn't process what was happening. I found out later that when I didn't come home, my roommate had reported me missing. My YouTube channel had my planned location for that night in a draft video and police had searched Riverview Hospital. They'd found my car in the parking area and then found the maintenance building with the hatch. It had taken them 3 days to search the tunnel system and find me. They found Dr. Klein and 4 members of her team and arrested them. They found the chamber with the computers and all the documentation of their experiments. They found the remains of 3 people buried in sealed tunnel sections. Dr. Klein and her team are awaiting trial on multiple charges, including kidnapping, assault, and murder. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering physically, and I've been in therapy ever since for the psychological damage. I have PTSD and I can't handle enclosed spaces anymore. I deleted my YouTube channel because I can't look at any of my old exploration videos without having panic attacks. I'm sharing this story because people need to know that Riverview Hospital isn't just an abandoned building that's fun to explore. There were people conducting illegal experiments down in those tunnels for years, and even though Dr. Klein's team was arrested, there might be others. The police found evidence that Dr. Klein had been in contact with other researchers doing similar work in abandoned locations throughout the Pacific Northwest. Some of those people haven't been identified or caught. If you're an urban explorer, please stay away from Riverview Hospital and be extremely careful exploring any abandoned psychiatric facilities. The people who use these places for illegal activities specifically target explorers because we go into dangerous locations alone and often don't tell people exactly where we are. 3 other explorers are still missing and their bodies haven't been found. Police think they might be in other tunnel systems that haven't been fully explored yet, or they might have been taken to different locations. I was one of the lucky ones who was found in time. Not everyone is that lucky. I'll never explore abandoned buildings again, and I won't go into any underground spaces. I can't even ride the subway anymore without having anxiety attacks. What Dr. Klein and her team did to me and the others has permanently damaged us, and some of that damage will never heal. Sometimes I still wake up in the night thinking I'm back in that room strapped to the bed hearing those sounds. Sometimes I see her face, Dr. Klein smiling and telling me I'm a good subject. My therapist says the flashbacks will fade with time, but it's been over a year and they're still vivid. The worst part is knowing that for 3 years they got away with it. 3 years of bringing people down into those tunnels and torturing them in the name of research, and nobody knew. How many other places like that exist? How many other abandoned facilities are being used by people conducting illegal experiments or worse? I think about that a lot and it terrifies me. The Pacific Northwest has hundreds of abandoned buildings and tunnel systems, and nobody is monitoring all of them. Urban exploration is supposed to be about appreciating history and architecture and the beauty of decay. It's not supposed to end with you strapped to a bed being tortured by a deranged psychiatrist and her team. But that's what happened to me, and it could happen to anyone who explores without being careful. So please, if you read this and you're thinking about exploring Riverview Hospital or any similar location, don't. It's not worth the risk. And if you know someone who explores abandoned places, make sure they always tell someone exactly where they're going and when they expect to be back. That's the only reason I survived. Stay safe out there, and remember that some abandoned places are abandoned for good reasons and some darkness is better left unexplored. Story 7: The Ranger Station at Deception Pass. I worked as a seasonal park ranger in Washington State for 3 summers, and what happened at the old Deception Pass station still keeps me up at night. This was back in 2019, and I was 22 years old and excited to spend my summer in the beautiful Pacific Northwest forests. They assigned me to cover the night shifts at an older ranger station near the pass because the regular guy had quit suddenly without giving any reason. My supervisor Mark seemed nervous when he handed me the keys and told me the station had been empty for almost 2 months. He said something about budget cuts, but I could tell he was lying because his hands were shaking when he gave me the orientation paperwork. The station was a small wooden building built in the 1960s with 2 rooms, one main office area with old filing cabinets and a desk, and a back room with a cot for overnight stays. The paint was peeling and everything smelled like mildew and old coffee. There were these huge windows facing the forest, and during the day you could see the beautiful Douglas firs, and the sound of birds was actually peaceful. My job was simple: monitor the radio for emergencies, do a perimeter walk every few hours, and keep the logbook updated. The first week was boring, and I spent most nights reading books and browsing my phone when I had signal. Then I started noticing the scratches. They were on the inside of the back room door, long deep gouges in the wood that went from about shoulder height all the way down to the floor. I asked Mark about them on my next check-in, and he got really quiet for a moment before saying something about a bear getting in years ago. But these scratches were on the inside of the door, which made no sense. Why would a bear scratch to get out of a room when the window was right there? I tried not to think about it too much. Around my third week, I was doing my 2 a.m. perimeter walk with my flashlight when I heard something moving in the woods about 50 feet from the station. It sounded big, like something pushing through the underbrush without caring about making noise. I stopped and pointed my flashlight toward the sound, but all I could see were trees and darkness. Then I heard it, a sound like someone trying to talk, but their mouth was full of water, gurgling and wet and wrong. I stood there frozen for maybe 10 seconds before I ran back to the station and locked the door. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the key. I radioed Mark, but he didn't respond because it was the middle of the night, so I sat at the desk with all the lights on and watched the windows until sunrise. Nothing appeared, but I could hear that wet gurgling sound circling the station for hours. When Mark came by the next morning, I told him everything and he went pale. He made me sit down, and then he told me about David, the ranger who quit. David had been working nights for 2 years, and apparently he'd been filing reports about strange sounds and movements around the station. Mark showed me the reports on his laptop, and my stomach dropped. David described the exact same gurgling sound, and he'd seen something he called the visitor. According to his last report, dated 3 days before he quit, David had been in the back room trying to sleep when he heard scratching on the window. He looked and saw a face pressed against the glass, but it wasn't quite right. He wrote that the proportions were wrong, eyes too far apart and mouth too wide, and the skin looked gray and wet like something that had been underwater too long. David screamed and the thing disappeared, but when he went outside to look the next morning, there were handprints on the window that looked almost human, except the fingers were too long and there were only 4 of them. Mark said David refused to come back after that night, and they couldn't find anyone else willing to take the position until I applied. I should have quit right then, but I was young and stupid, and honestly I needed the money. Mark offered to have someone else cover my shifts, but I said no because I didn't want to look scared. That was a mistake. The next few nights were quiet, and I started thinking maybe David had imagined things, or maybe it was just some weird animal I wasn't familiar with. Then, on Saturday night, during my 3 a.m. perimeter walk, I found the deer. It was about 30 yards from the station. A full-grown doe that looked like it had been torn apart by something with incredible strength. But that's not what scared me the most. The deer had been arranged in a circle with its legs pointing outward and its head placed in the center facing up. No animal does that. Animals kill to eat, not to make patterns. I took photos with my phone and radioed Mark immediately, even though it was the middle of the night. He answered on the second call, and I could hear his wife yelling in the background asking what was wrong. Mark told me to get back inside the station and lock everything, and he'd be there in 40 minutes. I ran back and locked myself in, and that's when I noticed the smell. It was like rotting fish mixed with wet earth, so strong it made my eyes water. The smell was coming from the back room. I didn't want to look, but I had to make sure nothing had gotten inside somehow. I opened the door slowly with my flashlight up and my hand on my pepper spray. The room looked empty, but the smell was overwhelming, and there was water all over the floor, even though there were no pipes in that room. Then I saw it in the corner behind the cot. At first I thought it was a pile of wet clothes, but then it moved. The thing stood up slowly, and it was tall, maybe 7 feet, with skin that looked like it was rotting and covered in pond scum. Its arms were too long and ended in those 4-fingered hands David had described. But the face was the worst part. It had eyes like a fish, flat and dead and too far apart, and when it opened its mouth I could see rows of small sharp teeth. It made that gurgling sound again and took a step toward me. I slammed the door and shoved the desk against it and grabbed the radio, screaming for Mark to hurry. The thing started pounding on the door so hard the whole station shook, and I could hear wood splintering. I ran out the front door into the parking lot and got in my truck and locked the doors. Through the station windows I could see the thing moving around inside, knocking over filing cabinets and tearing papers. Pressed its face against the window and looked right at me, and I swear it smiled. Mark arrived with 2 other rangers, and they had guns, which made me feel slightly better. We went inside together, but the thing was gone. The back room was destroyed, the cot was ripped to pieces, and there was water and that awful smell everywhere. They found a trail of wet footprints leading from the back room out to the broken window and into the forest. The footprints were shaped like human feet but longer and with only 4 toes. Mark made some calls and they closed that ranger station permanently the next week, citing structural damage. He told me the truth though. That station had always had problems and rangers had been reporting the visitor since the 1970s. They think it comes from the water because Deception Pass has these deep cold channels that connect to the ocean and nobody really knows what lives down there. Some of the old-timers say the Salish people have stories about water spirits that steal people who wander alone at night. They offered me a transfer to a different station, but I quit. I couldn't do it anymore knowing that thing was out there. Mark told me they think it fixates on certain people, and since it had seen me clearly through the window, I should be careful. That was 4 years ago, and I still check my windows every night before bed. Last month, I was camping with friends near Lake Crescent, which is about 2 hours from Deception Pass, and I woke up at 3 a.m. to that smell. Rotting fish and wet earth. I looked out of my tent and saw wet footprints leading from the lake to our campsite. For toes. We packed up and left before sunrise. I don't go near the water anymore in Washington. I don't care if people think I'm crazy. I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there looking for me. 8th narration, thumbs up the horror of St. Gabriel's Children's Hospital. St. Gabriel's is a giant cruciform of glass and brick in a Midwestern city known for big summers and colder winters. The campus is a cluster of buildings connected by second-floor skywalks and a grid of service tunnels beneath, concrete arteries you're not supposed to see if you're not maintenance or security. I worked night shift security there from 2018 to 2021. If you've never done nights in a hospital, the first thing you learn is that closed doesn't exist. Time doesn't either. On nights, a cafeteria microwave can sound like a car crash, and a kid within 4 pole becomes a ghost every time they turn a corner because your body expects stillness that never arrives. My job was to patrol the campus, parking decks, skywalks, and twice per shift the tunnels. They're utility corridors, 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide in the newer sections, narrower and lower in the old ones, lit by long rectangles of fluorescent bulbs every 30 feet. Every sound is either too loud or swallowed whole. You get used to it. You get used to the smell too. A metallic, humid heat from steam pipes, drier fresh lint from laundry, disinfectant, and the wet mineral scent where condensation builds on cinder block. For my first year, it was boring in the way that trains are boring. A set schedule, a set path. You walk. You badge doors. You log your position. You learn that most fear is expectation management. A door that creaks at noon will scream at 3 a.m., and the only difference is your heartbeat. If I have a year I'd call normal, it's that first one. Then March 2019 came and the tunnels learned my name. It was just past midnight on a Tuesday. I'd started in the south tunnel that runs beneath the main hospital toward the research building because that route turned around near the cafeteria, and if I timed it right, I could microwave a burrito before the night shift nurses robbed the vending machines. The place was empty except for distant machine sounds. Something cycling air, something else letting out a death rattle every few seconds. I was counting light spacing 3, 4, 5 panels when I heard a child crying. It wasn't the thin whine of a baby. It was that soft, wet, breath-hitching cry kids make when they're trying not to be heard. It came from the ahead and to the right, behind a door that should have been locked. Those doors are labeled the same way everywhere. Authorized personnel only, mechanical access code, sterile font. You learn their personalities. Some are stubborn even with the key. Some open if you breathe on them. This one didn't have a badge reader at all. Took a physical key I didn't carry. I radioed Marcus, the other guard on shift, and told him what I was hearing. I expected a lecture on how noise travels weird in tunnels. He said he'd meet me there with the maintenance key ring, and within 5 minutes I saw the swing of his flashlight. We listened before we opened it. The crying wasn't loud. Nothing you could triangulate. Just present, like water behind a wall. Marcus is 6 feet, a gym rat who wears his vest like it grew on him. He said, "Ready?" And I nodded, and the lock gave after a stiff turn. Behind the door was a short, unlit side tunnel. Our flashlights pushed a cone of dusty white down 50 feet of concrete and brick until it ended in an older wall. The floor had a film of powder on it, the way quiet places often do. We played the beam along the corners and our radio earpieces hummed. The crying didn't get louder. It was coming from inside everything: the walls, the air between us, the pipe along the ceiling that clinked as it expanded. We walked the length of it. Our footsteps made hollow chuff sounds that didn't feel synced to the rhythm of the crying. I remember thinking, if this is interference from the PED's ward, what are we hearing? A kid, alone at midnight? The floor dust didn't have footprints in it besides ours. The end wall looked sealed long ago. There wasn't room to hide a kid, and there wasn't a sound an adult could produce that would fake that specific version of pain. Marcus said pipes could carry voices like guitar strings. Acoustic weirdness, he said. I read about it. We wrote it in our log. The shift supervisor scrawled "check with facilities" and moved on. I heard the crying 3 more times that month, and each time it came from someplace inconvenient. Behind a locked panel that took 2 keys, from an area that was supposed to be closed for abatement, from a dead corner where the tunnels elbowed and narrowed. I wasn't the only one who heard it. Several guards started avoiding the south run, trading routes the way smokers trade lighters. Management said it was sound from upstairs, or a maintenance prank that would stop if we stopped rewarding it with attention. We were told not to include atypical noises likely from patient floors in the official log. Then a memo appeared. Limit time in non-essential recesses, and do not perform ad hoc inspections without authorization. We laughed about the words, non-essential recesses, because the tunnels are nothing but recesses. But we followed the memo. You learn early that hospitals are their own countries, and security is the force that keeps the border. We enforce, we don't investigate. June was when something touched me. I was alone at 4 a.m. because we were down a body. The tunnel under the original 1950s wing feels different from the rest. It's lower and made of older brick, and the lights are on individual pull chains, so the spacing is uneven. I had my routine. Check the south run, cut left at the elbow, badge the door with the corrosion around the latch, tap the pipe twice to listen for the rattle, that was my superstition, and back out. Halfway through, the lights went out all at once. I don't care how tough you are. If you're underground and everything you can see disappears, your hands look for light like animals. My flashlight was in my belt, but the Velcro caught, and a noise. Footsteps came toward me, small, quick, and close to the floor. The flashlight came free, and as the beam swung, the air moved past my left shoulder. Something ran by me. A small figure, barefoot, in a hospital gown, head down, arms close to the ribs. I shouted, "Hey!" the way you shout when you're not used to shouting, and ran. The figure turned a corner, and I turned seconds later into a dead end. I painted the wall with light. Nothing. No door, no hatch, no crawl space. The lights returned with that static snap fluorescent bulbs make when they wake up. The hallway looked normal in that flat institutional way, and the floor looked unmarked. I radioed for backup and spoke like a drunk because it's hard to edit fear. We searched the whole section. I led them to the dead end and embarrassed myself running my hands along a wall. Someone made a joke. No one laughed. I told my supervisor I wanted off tunnel patrol. He said I was experienced and needed at least one of the night runs. He did agree that I could take a partner, and from then on we did the tunnels in pairs. It helps to have a second set of ears. It also helps to be watched. When you have a partner, you feel accountable to the posture of your fear. You stand a little straighter. We heard the crying again. We saw shadows that didn't line up with our bodies. We smelled things that made no sense: smoke, dust, burned milk. You brush it off because that's what all of us do when we have to keep walking through the place that scares us. You don't think you're fragile because you haven't broken yet. October 2019, a maintenance worker named Jerry went missing. He was the kind of guy you remember easily. Short, restless, with braces he got late in life that made his smile look like a kid trying on teeth. He radioed facilities for access to the tunnels to check a steam leak, used the channel we all share, and that was the last time anyone heard his voice. They found his radio and a wrench lying side by side in the older tunnel. The cameras in that particular stretch staticked for 5 hours and came back like nothing had happened. The police came, the dogs came, and the hospital public relations statement used the word voluntary. You can't say vanished in an official letter. The emails asked us not to speculate in front of families. We nodded and didn't sleep. After Jerry, the hospital bought new cameras. Modern ones with night vision and motion detection, domes that can see in multiple directions. They put in new badge locks on the pump rooms, DPS mechanicals. They wrote a policy that nobody went down there alone anymore, not even for 5 minutes. I believed in the cameras. I believed in anything that could collect a record of the thing we were told not to name. December is when I saw the child the second time, but not with my eyes. There had been a theft from one of the storage rooms upstairs. Something petty, probably an employee. My job after the walkthrough was to scrub the footage for anything suspicious. Cameras are boring on purpose. You want motion to be a raccoon or a janitor or a piece of tape fluttering an event. I was letting the footage run on fast forward when one of the older tunnel segments lit up with motion alerts at 3:17 a.m. A child walked into the frame, barefoot, hospital gown, hair matted like they'd been sweating. The eyes were shadowed from the angle and looked voidish, but shadow trickery on night vision is a coin toss. The kid moved in a slow, deliberate way, like they were counting their steps and deciding where the next one should land. I toggled the next camera. The kid appeared again, still moving toward the junction that leads to the central mechanical room. The motion detection box tracked them the way it tracks anyone. I toggled camera after camera, and the child was there for 6 separate angles, always moving in the right direction as if the map of the place was printed on their feet. At the 7th camera, at the junction, the child stopped and turned to face the lens. The face was wrong. Not horror movie wrong, just human wrong, like a photograph with exposure damage. The eyes were shadowy pits even after I adjusted the gain. The mouth was a smile you'd recognize from a parent's bad dream, both too wide and too patient, like a performance of comfort. The child's chest moved like regular breathing. The gown hung in a way you only see in rooms where air conditioning never decided what the temperature should be. The child looked, then turned and went down the hall that led to the mechanical room, and when I toggled the next camera, they weren't there. I toggled backwards. I scrubbed forwards. I looked for a trick, a cut, a reflection. The motion tracker had logged the shape as a person, then logged nothing, as if that person had stepped through a filmed wall into a filmed vacuum. I called Paula, who had been on nights that week, and asked if she'd seen anything. She said no, then I showed her the footage. Paula is unflappable. She went pale. We checked every camera for the next 2 hours before and after. The kid appeared on 12 camera angles total. No entrance, no exit. The static wasn't random. It clustered around junctions and older walls. I saved the files and took them to my supervisor. He watched them with 2 administrators. There was a meeting. They called me back in later and told me the footage was a glitch. Something codec conflict. Something looped pre-installation test feed. I've never heard that many words piled into an apology for telling you to forget what you just saw. They told me to delete the files. I said no. They said they would take care of it. They did. I watched them type the server command, and the files were gone. They offered me a day shift. I said yes before I'd finished the sentence. They called it a reward for diligence. I called it self-preservation. You'd think days would fix it. They didn't. Knowing the tunnels were there, that the cameras saw something and the cameras were made to forget, made daylight into a lid on a box that something was scratching. I started dreaming about the tunnels. It wasn't cinematic. It was spatially accurate. My brain gave me an architect's tour. This corner, that elbow, this dead end. In the dream, the lights were on, but the shadows were wrong. Sound came from the floor, like someone crying through concrete. When I woke, it was always 3:17 a.m. I don't know if I woke because I looked at the clock and wired the number to the waking, or if my brain set an alarm for the moment the kid walked past the junction. It doesn't matter. I stopped sleeping. I lived on coffee and the quick anger that comes when you're terrified all the time and pretending not to be. By the time March 2021 staggered in, 3 years into my career at St. Gabriel's, I counted my remaining sanity in measurable units. 8 minutes of sitting without my back against a wall, 30 seconds of closing my eyes in a locked room, The number of steps it takes to walk from the day desk to the staff bathroom without feeling watched. David, a new guard with a day-old uniform and a baby he showed us on his phone every chance he got, disappeared on nights. Same thing. Radioed that he was going to check a noise in the tunnels, never came back. Cameras hiccuped on the relevant angles. His flashlight and radio were found, placed in a way that looked intentional. The hospital talked about grief resources, then sent another memo about unauthorized access and rumor control. The night after David, I walked into HR and turned in my badge. The HR director asked me to sign updated paperwork, including an NDA that specifically named non-public zones, including, but not limited to, utility corridors and mechanical rooms. She slid it across the desk with a pen and a severance packet bigger than any I'd seen. She held the pen in a way that said there was only one version of this conversation. I signed. I walked out. I went home. My apartment, which had been fine, felt wrong. Basements felt like choices bad people made in old houses, so I moved to the third floor of a building with no elevator, and I have never regretted the daily cardio. If this were the end, I'd be the person who put a scary job in a box and put the box in a closet. But boxes leak. I started reading. You don't have to dig far to find the part of any city that belonged to something else. Before St. Gabriel's, there was a city hospital, and before that a military installation, and before that farm and woods. The tunnels, they said, were built in phases, first for steam, then for electric, then because once you have one tunnel you need another so the people who work in the places people don't go can get from A to B without freezing in a blizzard. I found a line here and there about a fire in an orphanage in the early 1900s. 17 dead, the newspaper said, but the paper back then formatted tragedy like weather, a sentence that fit between the meat prices and the church schedule. A map showed the orphanage in a rectangle that, if you squinted, overlapped the St. Gabriel's footprint. I saw forum posts from former staff. Anonymous, unverified, unreliable, perfect, talking about voices in the grates and the boy in the gown in the old wing. I knew which words were legend because they sounded like narration. I knew which ones were closer to the bone because they were short. You hear it too? One said. I hate walking under pediatrics, another said. One day I turned off the light and it turned itself back on. I know what a sane person does. They say coincidence and move on. My body disagreed. Panic isn't a sentence. It's a physical setting. When your chest learns a place, when your hands learn the shape of a flashlight and your feet count concrete squares, you carry that place with you. The tunnels were under a hospital, and then they were under me, and then I was always walking through them even if my front door was locked and my lamp was on. Daylight work didn't save most of us. Paula left 6 months after I did, and in a span of 2 years I can count half a dozen night guards who rotated out and never gave a reason deeper than better hours. Marcus stayed a while longer. He texted me once at 3:18 a.m., a mistake or a scream for help typed quietly, and it was a photo of a blank camera screen with the motion box flashing red and empty. Glitch, he typed. LOL. He deleted it 2 minutes later. I've wondered about those 2 minutes every night since. If you want me to give you something that reads like proof, I can't. That's the first rule the tunnels enforce. Nothing you can carry will make it past the place where the air changes. The second rule is that if something wants you to leave, it tells you by moving toward you and stopping when you point a light at it. The third rule is that when humans name a thing, we file it as solved. St. Gabriel's administration named what we saw a glitch. It was not solved. A friend says what I do here is how trauma talks. A list of facts you can't stack because they slip. He says I'm making a pattern from dots because patterns feel safer than dots. He's probably right. Doesn't matter. What you should hear is that a hospital can have a place inside it that performs hospital functions. Heat moves here, water here, electricity here, and also performs something else, something we're not built to admit. If you build a corridor under rooms where children die and children live and children sleep and wake and cry and watch the ceiling tiles, the corridor becomes a throat. Sound travels. Sometimes it speaks back. I kept a map in my head. People joke that security guards are failed cops, failed military, failed something. Mostly we're boring, which is better than failing at the wrong thing. But we get good at maps. A hospital has a public map with gentle icons and color-coded hallways, and then it has the map we carry. The public map says cafeteria, chapel, gift shop. Our map says pump room, electrical, the turn where you have to duck, the door that looks like nothing but leads to everything. In my dreams, the wrong map superimposes over the right one. The nun art in the chapel becomes a punch-out panel for an access hatch. The skywalk flooring is the same non-slip surface as the floor over the laundry service. People pray over a place where steam condenses and drips like slow rain. The kid in the gown became something my world rotated around. I told myself that if I'd seen a face in better light, it would have made sense. A real kid wandering the way kids escape. But kids don't slip through cameras. They don't turn when an unmanned lens stares at them and hold a smile that isn't about you or them. They don't stop appearing in the footage when it matters most. You read this stuff and think, why didn't you call a newspaper, a TV station, a priest? Because the part of your brain that knows a thing isn't right is not the same part that speaks into microphones. And because institutions are immune to noise until something bleeds on the wrong floor. 2 weeks after I quit, I saw a boy in a blue gown on the sidewalk outside the urgent care entrance. His hair was wet, like he'd just been bathed, and his feet were bare despite the cold. He stood with his hands at his sides and his chin down, as if he were waiting or counting. A nurse came out behind him with a plastic bag of discharge paperwork and said his name, an everyday name that made the air feel less solid. And the boy looked up and the face was just a kid's face, too thin, too pale, too tired. He blinked. The nurse took his hand and they went inside. I stood across the street and cried because my body had prepared for the wrong thing and didn't know where to put the leftover fear. That's the part people get wrong about haunted places. The fear doesn't live there. It sets up a bed in you and pays rent in blood pressure and bad dreams. You become the site. So I moved. I climbed 3 flights of stairs every day and lied to myself about why that was okay. I replaced my overhead bulbs with ones that say daylight on the box. I got to know the neighbors because that felt like a talisman. I am known, therefore I am visible. When I wake at 3:17, I get up and put my hands on the drywall and I listen. The wall doesn't cry. Neither do I, mostly. You want a reason? You won't get one from me. People die in hospitals and the places under hospitals are made to move that fact around without anyone upstairs having to look at it. That's not a supernatural sentence. That's engineering. We tidy away heat and waste and minutes no one wants to count. The tunnels keep the promise and the promise becomes a story and the story becomes a voice. I heard it. Others did too. If you work in a place like that and your job says you're the type of person who should go underground, pay attention when your hands start to shake at a door with a label that says nothing about crying children. A tech I liked, quiet, kept sunflower seeds in his breast pocket, once said something that stayed with me. We were watching contractors install one of the new cameras and he said, "You ever think we built the tunnels because we were already pretending there were tunnels? Like the idea needed a body." He was joking. He went stiff when he realized he'd said it out loud. There's an old story about the hospital. I don't know how old. It's about a kid in the 60s who got lost during construction. A nurse told it to me in a whisper between shifts the way some people confess affairs. Quick, with eyes on the hallway. The story says the kid wandered down when the elevator was open and the light over B was on. The workers didn't realize he was missing right away because his chart said, restless. Someone found him 3 days later curled up by a wall with a soft smile on his face like someone had told him it would be okay. The workers sealed the area after and the nurse said that's when the crying started. I asked which wall. She didn't answer. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe some facts are only as real as the breath that carries them. I write this like a report because that's how you think you'll be believed. But there's a part one haven't said because I don't like the person it makes me. On my last week at St. Gabriel's, after I'd signed the transfer to days but before I left, I took the morning patrol through a tunnel I didn't have to walk. It was irrational. I could have filled the log with cafeteria checks and elevator tests and been left alone. But I went. I needed to stand in the place where the footage had shown the child looking at the camera. Daylight filtered down from somewhere through a grate. It made a rectangle on the floor like a window in a church. I stood at the junction and said out loud, "I'm not coming back." The air felt thick and listened. I walked past the mechanical room door, past a patch of wall older than the rest, and stopped because it sounded like someone breathing inside brick. Not in pain, not sleeping, breathing, counting. Inhale, exhale. It stopped when I touched the wall. I took my hand away and the breath resumed. I did it 3 times. I said, "I'm sorry," because I didn't know else what to say and left. 2 nights ago, I woke at 3:17 a.m. with the certainty that someone was standing at the foot of my bed. That's the simplest sentence I can write about it. I knew because my body balanced for a shout. I didn't shout. I did what I learned to do. Don't move quickly, don't pretend you're braver than you are, and find the light. The overhead is a pull chain. I pulled it and the room flattened into the wrong color of day. No one was there. The corner of the room looked like it always does, with the plant I keep killing and the chair no one sits in. On the floor between the chair and the closet, there were 2 wet footprints. Small, bare. The shapes had the distorted heel-to-toe ratio kids have because their feet haven't figured out how to be feet yet. My brain said pipes, condensation, air conditioning, roof leak, anything, and I went into the bathroom and shook the shower curtain and touched the faucet and checked under the sink for a drip that would be good enough to make me stop shaking. I came back and the footprints had almost dried. I sat on the bed and tried to match their shape with the bottom of my own foot, then with my hand, then with nothing. The space between them was too short for an adult stride. They ended at the edge of the rectangle of light from my overhead bulb. It would be funny if this were a story that wanted to be funny. It wasn't. I didn't call anyone. Who would I call? There are sentences you can say if you never want to be asked back to a conversation. There were wet footprints in my bedroom at 3 a.m. and they weren't mine, is one of them. I cleaned the floor and watched the residue evaporate and thought about the junction near the central mechanical room and the way the kid in the footage turned toward the camera like it was a person. I hate that I am writing this. I hate that I am the person whose hands sweat on a keyboard because typing it feels like transgression. I hate the idea that there's another person on a different night shift who will be told not to log the thing they heard because it scares the new staff. I hate that this is how I align myself with my fear. Giving it sentences, handing it to strangers, hoping someone sees themselves in it and changes a small action that saves something I'll never know about. If you work security at a hospital, here are the only rules I trust. If you hear a child crying behind a mechanical access door, call someone and don't open it alone. If you open it with someone, keep the door propped and your body in the doorway. If the crying doesn't change when the door opens, remember that. If the lights go out in a place where they don't go out, do not move faster than you can think. Find your flashlight before you need it. Find your partner before you need them. If you see a child in a gown and they move like someone who doesn't care if they're seen, don't follow them into a blind spot. People who need help move like their body is a question. People who are not people move like a rehearsal. If the camera tells you a story and the server says it never happened, ask yourself who benefits from forgetting. Then remember anyway. I walked away from St. Gabriel's. Others didn't. I think about Jerry when I pass a hardware store because he would have liked the way the new models of wrenches fit the hand. I think about David when I pass a stroller. I think about the kid with the wrong face when I wake in the middle of the night and the apartment is both loud and silent and I can hear the hum of the building moving itself around me. I have not gone back. I plan never to. I know that plans are flimsy in the hands of the thing that lives under them. When I start to feel like a fool for believing any of this happened the way it did, I try to do something I learned from a therapist who knew how to talk to people like me. She said, "Make a reasonable list and read it like instructions." Reasonable list. Tunnels exist under hospitals. They carry steam, water, electric, and access. They are not designed for the public. They are working places that behave like working places. Loud at the wrong times, hot in the wrong corners, and empty when empty is dangerous. People go missing in cities. Not every missing person is a story that folds into another story. Not every absence is a theft. Some are choices. Some are accidents. Some are contingencies we don't have names for. Cameras glitch. Servers fail. Administrators worry that fear is a disease and contain it like one. Ghost stories are how communities compress stress. That doesn't mean they're not also diaries of grief. If a child's voice travels through a building built to carry sound, you can hear it where you shouldn't. It's 3:08 a.m. now. I'm typing this on a laptop bright enough to make the rest of the room look like a hallway. If I hit post, I'll tell myself I did it because someone needed to read it. If I don't, I'll tell myself I didn't because I'm impulsive and dramatic and scared of the wrong thing. Either way, I'll still turn on the bathroom light and check the tub because I don't have the kind of brain that lets me keep doors closed. A minute ago, there was a sound through the wall like a breath held and released. Could be a neighbor, could be the building, could be my own pulse echoing inside my ears. This is the part where I should say I know the difference. I don't. I can say only that I remember the way the air in the tunnel changed in shape when I said I wasn't coming back. And I remember the way the new cameras hummed when they turned and something stood in front of them. And I remember the way a smile can be a warning when it isn't attached to anything like comfort. It's 3:16 now. If I can make it to 3:18 without hearing the chain on the overhead light move on its own, without seeing. I saw the markers with the dead crows again going the opposite direction. When I reached the spot where I'd seen the woman in the road, there was something lying in the middle of the road. As I got closer, I could see it was a pile of bones, animal bones maybe, arranged in a circular pattern. I drove around it carefully, not wanting to know what it meant. About 5 miles from the highway, I saw them again. They were standing in a line along the left side of the road, maybe 20 of them, all facing the road and watching as I passed. They didn't move or follow, just stood there watching with those blank white eyes. I counted 23 of them before the road curved and I lost sight. I reached Highway 101 just after 6 a.m. and I've never been more relieved to see pavement and traffic signs. I drove straight to the mill and delivered my load and filed my report. The logging company called me 2 days later and offered me another run to the same site, double pay. I turned it down. They offered triple pay and I still said no. Some money isn't worth it. I talked to other truckers and found 3 who'd also done runs to that site. They all reported similar experiences, seeing people on the road who didn't look quite right, feeling like they were being followed, finding strange markers and arrangements of bones. One driver said something had jumped onto his trailer while he was moving and he'd heard it walking around on top for miles before it finally jumped off. None of them would take contracts for that site anymore. The logging company shut down operations there in March 2023, citing safety concerns. I heard through the trucking network that 2 more workers had disappeared in the final weeks, just vanished during their shifts. Search parties found no trace of them. The company blamed bears or accidents, but everyone who'd worked there knew better. I still drive through Washington, but I avoid that area completely now. I won't take any routes that go near Forks or into the Olympic National Forest. I keep Rick's bundle of sage and tobacco on my dashboard, and I don't drive on unmarked forest roads anymore, no matter how much they pay. Sometimes late at night on empty highways, I think about those things standing in the forest watching the logging site. I wonder how many of them there are and where they came from and what they want. Rick's theory was that they were spirits protecting the forest, but I think they might have been something worse. Maybe they were people once, loggers or hikers or indigenous people from long ago who died in those woods and became something else. Maybe the forest changed them. Whatever they are, they're still out there and they don't want us in their territory. If you drive through Washington and you see wooden posts with dead birds tied to them on the side of the road, turn around immediately. If you see people standing in the forest with long dark hair covering their faces, drive faster and don't look back. And if you're ever offered a job at a logging site in the Olympic National Forest, ask the locals about it first. The indigenous people know which places should be left alone, and they have good reasons for their warnings. I ignored those warnings because I needed the money and I got lucky enough to leave. Not everyone is that lucky. The 2 workers who disappeared are still missing, and I don't think they'll ever be found. They're in the forest now with the others, and they're not coming back. Narration 11. The cave system under Multnomah Falls. My brother Daniel and I were experienced cavers. We'd been exploring caves throughout Oregon and Washington since we were teenagers. Our dad had taught us proper caving technique. Always use the buddy system. Always tell someone where you're going. Always have backup lights and supplies. We followed those rules religiously for 15 years and never had a serious problem until we found the cave entrance behind Multnomah Falls in April 2021. I'm Ryan Kowalski. I'm 31 years old, and my brother was 28 when he disappeared. I need to tell this story because the search and rescue teams gave up after 2 weeks, and the official report says Daniel probably fell into an underground river and drowned. That's not what happened, and his body is still down there, and I'm the only one who knows why he's never coming back. Multnomah Falls is one of the most visited tourist sites in Oregon. this beautiful waterfall that drops over 600 feet in 2 major steps. There are paved trails and viewing platforms, and thousands of people visit every year. But most tourists don't know that the Columbia River Gorge, where the falls are located, is full of caves and lava tubes from ancient volcanic activity. Some are mapped and some aren't. Daniel and I had explored several caves in the gorge over the years, and we were always looking for new systems to map. In early April, we were hiking off-trail above the falls, up in the forest where tourists don't go, looking for cave entrances. We'd heard rumors from other cavers about an unmapped system somewhere in that area. Around 3 p.m. we found it, a narrow opening between 2 large boulders about half a mile from the main trail. The opening was maybe 2 feet wide, and when we shined our lights inside, we could see it opened into a larger passage. We were excited because this looked like it might be a significant find. We had our gear with us, helmets with lights, rope, first aid kit, water, and energy bars. We marked the entrance location on our GPS and took photos. We'd planned to just scout the entrance and come back another day with more equipment, but Daniel wanted to check out at least the first chamber. I agreed because we had a few hours before dark and the entrance looked stable. We squeezed through the opening and dropped about 8 feet into a larger tunnel. Our lights showed a passage about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide extending into darkness. The walls were basalt rock with a rough texture, and the floor was uneven but walkable. The air smelled damp and mineral-rich, normal for caves in this area. We started forward, marking our route with reflective tape every 30 feet so we could find our way back. The tunnel sloped downward gradually, and after about 200 feet it opened into a larger chamber, maybe 40 feet across. Our lights showed stalactites hanging from the ceiling and a small pool of clear water in one corner. It was beautiful, exactly the kind of discovery that made caving exciting. We spent maybe 20 minutes exploring the chamber and taking photos and measurements. Then Daniel noticed another passage leading out of the far side of the chamber, smaller than the entrance tunnel, maybe 3 feet high. We'd have to crawl, but it looked passable. Daniel wanted to see where it went, and I said we should mark it and come back another day with better equipment. We argued for a minute, and Daniel said he'd just check the first 50 feet, and if it didn't open up, we'd leave. I agreed reluctantly. We crawled into the passage single file with Daniel in the lead. The passage was tight and uncomfortable, and I had to remove my backpack and push it ahead of me. After about 30 feet, the passage did open up into another tunnel where we could stand. This tunnel was different though. The walls looked almost carved instead of natural, with smooth surfaces and straight edges. Daniel said maybe it was an old mining tunnel, but there were no records of mines in this exact area. We continued forward, and the tunnel branched into 3 directions. This was getting complicated, and I said we should definitely turn back and map this properly another time. Daniel agreed, and we started back. That's when we noticed the symbols. They were carved into the wall at the junction. 3 symbols we hadn't seen when we passed through before. I know we would have noticed them. They were large and deliberate, maybe 8 inches tall each. The symbols didn't match any alphabet I recognized. They looked almost pictographic, simple figures of stick people and circles and wavy lines. Daniel took photos, and we discussed what they might mean. They looked old, the edges worn smooth. We continued back toward the crawl passage, but when we reached where it should have been, we found a solid wall instead. This didn't make sense. We'd only been away from that spot for maybe 10 minutes. We searched the entire area with our lights, but the crawl passage was gone. The wall looked ancient and undisturbed, like it had always been there. Daniel checked his compass and GPS, but the compass was spinning randomly and the GPS showed no signal, which was normal underground. We tried to stay calm and think logically. Maybe we'd gotten turned around and this was a different junction. We retraced our steps to the tunnel with the symbols and tried a different route. This led to another chamber we hadn't seen before, smaller and dome-shaped with more of those carved symbols covering the walls. Hundreds of them, floor to ceiling, all those stick figures and circles and wavy lines. In the center of the chamber was a pit maybe 6 feet across. We approached carefully and shined our lights down. The pit went deep. Our lights couldn't reach the bottom, and we could hear water running far below. Next to the pit was a pile of objects, old objects, that looked like they'd been placed there deliberately. We examined them with our lights, and I felt my stomach drop. There were bones, human bones, a skull and ribs, and long bones all arranged in a specific pattern. There were also personal items, a rotted backpack, a rusted canteen, boots that looked like they were from decades ago, and a helmet with a dead carbide lamp. Someone had died down here long ago, and their body had been arranged by the pit. Daniel was breathing fast, and I could tell he was starting to panic. We needed to find a way out now. We left the chamber and tried another tunnel. This one led to a steep slope going down, and we could hear that water sound getting louder. Against my better judgment, we followed the slope because maybe it led to an underground stream that would eventually exit somewhere. The slope was slippery and we had to move carefully. At the bottom was an underground river, black water moving fast through a channel maybe 15 feet wide. The tunnel continued on the other side of the river, but there was no obvious way across. We followed the river downstream, hoping to find a narrower crossing point. After about 5 minutes, we saw a light ahead. Not our lights, a different light, flickering and orange like firelight. We approached carefully and found another chamber. This one had torches, actual burning torches mounted on the walls, lighting the space with dancing shadows. In the center of the chamber were people. At least a dozen people sitting in a circle on the ground. They were all facing inward toward something in the middle we couldn't see clearly. They wore strange clothes, mix of modern and old-fashioned, all dirty and torn. None of them moved or acknowledged us, even though we were standing at the entrance with our lights pointed at them. Daniel called out asking if they needed help. No response. We stepped into the chamber slowly. As we got closer, I could see what they were looking at. In the center of the circle was a hole in the floor similar to the pit we'd seen earlier. The people were all staring into it. We walked around the edge of the circle trying to see their faces. The first person we got close to was a man, maybe 40 years old, with a beard and wearing a jacket that looked like it was from the 1980s. His eyes were open, but he wasn't blinking. He just stared into the pit. We moved to the next person, a woman wearing hiking clothes that looked more recent, maybe from the 2000s. Same blank stare. We checked all of them and they were all the same, sitting cross-legged, eyes open, not moving, just staring. Daniel touched one of them on the shoulder and the person didn't react at all. Their skin was cold. I checked for a pulse on the woman and felt nothing. They were dead but sitting upright. Daniel started hyperventilating and I had to grab him and make him focus. We needed to get out immediately. We backed away from the circle and left the chamber quickly. We followed the river upstream this time, hoping to find where we'd originally entered. The tunnel branched multiple times and we took turns randomly because we had no map and no idea where we were anymore. We walked for what felt like hours. Our lights started to dim and I checked my watch. It was showing 9 p.m., which meant we'd been underground for 6 hours. We should have been out in 2 hours maximum based on how far we'd explored. We found another chamber and Daniel said we should rest for a few minutes and save our light batteries. We sat down and drank some water and tried to think. That's when we heard the singing. It started quietly, coming from multiple directions at once, echoing through the tunnels. It was in a language I didn't recognize, repetitive and rhythmic like a chant. Daniel grabbed my arm and we stood up. The singing got louder and we could hear footsteps now, lots of them, coming from several different tunnels. We ran. We picked a tunnel at random and ran as fast as we could on the uneven floor. Behind us, the singing continued and the footsteps kept pace. We ran through tunnel after tunnel, turning randomly, just trying to get away. My lungs burned and my legs felt weak, but fear kept me moving. We rounded a corner and almost fell into a pit. We stopped just at the edge, our lights showing it dropped straight down into darkness. We backed away and tried another direction. The singing was all around us now and I could see movement in our peripheral vision, shadows at the edge of our lights. Then Daniel tripped. He went down hard and his helmet flew off and his light went out when it hit the ground. I stopped and went back for him. He was holding his ankle saying he'd twisted it badly. I helped him up and he leaned on me. We continued forward more slowly now. That's when they appeared. People stepped out from side passages ahead of us, blocking our path. They looked like the people we'd seen in the circle, wearing clothes from different eras, all with that same blank expression. But these ones were moving. They walked toward us slowly and deliberately. We turned to go back and found more behind us. We were surrounded. They closed in and I could see their faces clearly now in my light. Their eyes were open but unfocused like they were sleepwalking. Some of them were mumbling under their breath, in that same strange language. They reached out with their hands and touched us, cold fingers on our arms and faces. Daniel was screaming and I was trying to fight them off, but there were too many. Story 12. Graveyard on Aisle 12. I took the overnight shift at the 24-hour Walmart off Highway 12 because it was steady pay and the only thing open in our town after 10 p.m. And if you've ever lived in a Pacific Northwest place, that's mostly logging trucks, rain, and 2 coffee stands fighting over the same corner, graveyard means you'll get about 9 people in 6 hours. All of them interesting in ways you can't put on a job application, so I learned the rhythms. The fisherman at 2:15 a.m. grabbing worms and black coffee pods, the nurse on swing shift buying microwave dinners and Epsom salt for her feet, the kid with the lifted Subaru who claimed he was just browsing, but always left with a single bottle of fuel additive, and then the quiet hour from 3 to 4 when the floor scrubber did its whining circuits and the radios popped at random like they were picking up the weather coming off the bay, and I'd count end caps by heart and try not to notice the way the automatic doors breathed open. Even when the parking lot was empty, it was in that hour I first saw the ranger. I didn't know he was a ranger at first, only that he came in out of a rain so fine it looked like dust and stood just inside the vestibule like he wasn't sure how to enter the modern world. He wasn't wearing the bright green jacket the newer crews wear, but the old khaki shirt with the patch on the sleeve and the dark wool coat, buttons polished, and a hat he kept in his hands like a thing with a story. He nodded at me the way older people do when they don't want to chat but also don't want to be rude, and I did the same, and then he walked slow into camping like he'd been walking slow for 50 years. I didn't think much of it until my radio crackled with a code I hadn't heard in months, Code Adam, which is for a missing child. My stomach sank because there were only 2 customers in the building, the ranger and an insomniac buying bleach, and our night lead, Kelsey, always panicked when codes fired because the manager who trained her ran the store like a ship and she'd inherited his superstition that a bad code drew district attention. We did the drill. I walked the main racetrack, looked down the clothing rows, then toys, then seasonal. No kid. I passed camping and the ranger was staring at a row of old-school lantern mantles like he recognized a brand that had been gone for years. His lips moving like he was reading, and when he saw me he touched the brim of the hat he wasn't wearing and said, "Evening." His voice had that dry twang you get when you've spent more hours talking into a handheld radio than into people. I told him we were running a quick sweep because the system hiccuped. He smiled politely like he didn't know what that meant. I asked if he needed help finding anything. He said, "Fuel tabs." And I pointed him to the shelf even though my brain snagged on the words because no one calls it that anymore. On the way back to the registers, I checked the front door camera monitor and saw something that made me lean in close. The vestibule screen showed the ranger stepping inside again, raining behind him, timestamp 3:12 a.m., which was when I'd first seen him, but the live feed had him in aisle 38, turning a box of mantles in his hands. I told myself the recording loop was lagging. Then the intercom crackled, "Last call." It made no sense because we never closed. I looked at Kelsey, who was tearing open a case of Red Bulls near self-checkout, and she gave me a face like, "Did you hit a button?" I shook my head. She walked over, flipped to the store channel, and asked who was on the PA. No answer. The intercom let out a long breath like someone was holding the key and forgot to talk. The scrubber groaned past like a big sulking dog, and we both laughed because sometimes you laugh when the store creeps on you. Otherwise, you let it creep in. The ranger came to the front with a small basket, mantles, a tin of waterproof matches, a roll of jute twine, and a bag of unscented coffee, the kind no one buys unless they want campfire coffee to taste like water. He had cash, exact bills, worn and soft like old pages. I told him most folks use cards now, apologetic, not judgmental. He nodded like it was fine, like he'd expected that answer. I asked if he was camping. He said, "Returning to post," and smiled in a way that made me picture an old lookout tower in the rain. We were quiet while the register chirped. I handed him his change and said, "Long night." He said, "It's all long when the fire stays in the trees." And the hair on my arms lifted because the only thing in the news that week had been one stubborn wildfire in a corner of state forest that kept puffing back to life even after the rain. And I'd watched footage of a ranger in a wool coat standing at a cut-off road trying to wave locals back. "Stay safe," I said. And he gave me the hat tip again and walked out, slow, into the vestibule. The doors opened for him. The parking lot was empty. He kept walking anyway, into the rain that fell diagonally like slate dust, and vanished past the cart corral. The vestibule camera showed him leaving at 3:27. 5 minutes later, the intercom played a tone I know from growing up in this state. The emergency alert system test, flat and official. Except it wasn't the usual 3-beep, and no voice followed, and the tone rolled out longer than made sense until the store kind of prickled like static and the LED bulbs over pharmacy flickered. Kelsey swore, slapped the PA off at the service desk, and said her keyholder code wouldn't silence it. The tone stopped on its own. Then our doors whooshed open again by themselves. Wind rolled 2 receipts off the end of lane 9 and sent them skating down toward toys. It took me longer than it should have to realize I was holding the Ranger's receipt in my hand, except the paper was thicker, almost fabric, and instead of the Walmart header, it had a stamp at the top, Station 7 General Issue, with a pine tree in the middle and the date written in pencil, October 17th. This was October, so that checked out. What didn't? No year. Underneath, an item read mantles, 4.40, waxed match tin 0.25, coffee 0.10, and the total 0.75. I closed my eyes, counted to 3, opened them. It still said what it said. I walked to Kelsey to show her, but by the time I reached the desk, the paper in my hand was a normal thermal slip and the items listed in modern UPC shorthand with a $13 total. And I knew if I told her what I thought I'd seen, I'd hear my own voice and not believe it. So I put the receipt under the cash drawer like always and told myself retail does weird things to your brain at 3 in the morning. 3 nights later, he came back. Same hour, same rain like powdered glass in the lot lights, same slow walk. I was zoning end caps and grocery and saw him on the reflection of the freezer case glass before I saw him proper, because something about him didn't feel like a person you confront head-on. And he was looking at the row of camp stoves with this resigned expression like he already knew none of them were right, like the good ones had been replaced with something that wouldn't hold up to a storm. This time he asked for lamp oil. We don't carry it anymore. Most folks use propane or battery lanterns. I told him so, and he nodded like he'd known I would and asked for white gas, which we also don't stock, fire codes and all. He looked tired in a way not about sleep. I offered a battery pack and LED lantern. He said, "Those don't sing," then softer, "They don't talk back when you're waiting." I didn't understand, but also understood perfectly. I dug around until I found one dusty box of Coleman fuel someone had pushed behind a row of plastic totes, probably returns, and when I brought it over he looked almost embarrassed, as if asking the store for favors felt like asking the forest for sun. He paid cash again. Exact change. The intercom coughed. A voice I didn't recognize announced, "Store closing in 10 minutes?" In a careful, pleasant tone, Kelsey slapped the talk button and snapped, "We're 24 hours." And her voice went store-wide, bouncing back like a ghost yelling at itself. The vestibule doors hissed open. Cold air slid over the floor like water finding low places. My radio popped and I heard the tail of a transmission. "Post 41, do you copy?" And then a long crackle. I didn't know what Post 41 meant, but a story I'd read online about some ranger station numbered in the 40s grabbed me by the back of the head, and I told my brain to stop borrowing creepypasta. That's not helpful, that's not real, that's just your love of being spooked trying on a costume. The ranger gathered his small bag and paused like he had something else to say, and I realized he wasn't looking at me anymore but past me, toward the big wall of TVs by electronics that looped promotional footage of fishing families and drone shots of mountains, and every screen had stopped on the same still image. A wooden watchtower hunched on a bald ridge under a sky that was the color of an old bruise, a thin thread of smoke unraveling from the treeline below. The caption at the bottom of the screen, where prices usually roll, said, "Outpost 41, live feed." I didn't breathe. Kelsey said, "What the actual?" and pulled her phone like she was about to film proof for the group chat. But before she could swipe open the camera, the TVs blinked and went back to a smiling couple buying kayaks they absolutely did not need. The ranger didn't look surprised. He just nodded once at the image that wasn't there anymore and said to no one in particular, "Still standing." Right then, 3 teenage boys in wet hoodies burst through the doors, loud with the relief of having a place to be, and that broke the spell. I bagged the ranger's purchase. He said thank you. He walked into the rain. When I tried to watch him on the vestibule cam, the screen was snow. I went to electronics later to see if Outpost 41, live feed, was some weird Roku channel someone had left open. It wasn't. The demo loop had nothing like it. That night, after close, though we don't close, I pulled the receipt again from under the cash till and found the pencil-stamped tree still pressed into the paper like a watermark you can't capture with a phone. I didn't tell anyone. If you work nights, you get used to keeping odd little things to yourself. A week after that, a kid went missing near the river. Everyone in town knew because the search volunteers used our parking lot as a rally point. State Patrol, volunteers in orange vests, dogs too eager for their own safety. The posters went up on our sliding doors and we handed out hot coffee to anyone who asked. In the last hour of my shift, the ranger walked in dripping, but this time he was moving like the rain was inside his joints, not on them. He set his hat on the service desk like an offering. "You see him?" he asked, and he didn't have to say who. I told him I wasn't on the search. He nodded and said, "They always come to the edge when the lamps are strongest, then walk back." He left again with nothing bought and the feeling in my chest that I'd failed a test I hadn't known I was taking. Later, when the posters came down and the volunteers became a quieter kind of tired, someone taped a different paper to the door. "Thank you, community," signed by the family. No remains, no news, just the thank you. Nights resumed their ordinary weird. The scrubber sulked. The radios picked up wind. Once, around 3:03 a.m., the intercom popped and a voice said, "Report in, Outpost 41. Said the PA handset wasn't even in its cradle, and I said nothing because the ranger had taught me not everything wants an audience. The last night I saw him, it wasn't raining. The sky had that quilted look it gets when the clouds split into squares and float lower than they should. He came in carrying nothing and looked somehow smaller, as if the store had grown or the aisles had learned to lean away from him. He asked for AAA maps, paper ones, and a pencil. We had a spin rack of Rand McNally road atlases by Automotive. He frowned at their glossy certainty and said, "Do you have the older set, the ones with the lookout marks?" I told him we didn't. He asked for a payphone again, not directly but with his eyes, and I said we had the courtesy phone at the back by the Vision Center, which is a mean joke if you know we ripped it out 2 years ago. He smiled anyway and said, "I'll manage." At the register, he paid with a $1 coin and a nickel that looked like it had been rubbed for luck since statehood. I put them aside for deposit and found, after he left, that both had been replaced by copier paper circles cut and drawn with pencil. A kid's idea of money. I thought about chasing him into the lot with his fake coins, but when the doors opened on my way out, the night smelled like a campfire far off and a breeze moved over my face with the same polite firmness the ranger had. Like a hand reminding you to step back from the edge, and I let him keep the change that wasn't. I didn't see him again for a month. I did see his hat. Not physically, but on the TV wall, third screen from the left, for 1 second. A dark brim hung on a peg in a room with wood walls and a map of our county pinned up with red thread running between tiny XS, and when I leaned closer I realized the map pins lined up with places kids dared each other to go after midnight. Old Sylvan Bridge, Devil's Ladder, the drowned stump field by the dam, and one pin was our store. The feed was gone when I blinked. I went home by the long way that night, past the old shuttered grain tower, and for the first time in years I noticed the outline of a tower on the ridge when the clouds thinned. A simple square in moonlight that could have been anything. An old logging spar, a radio rig, or a watchman's roost. It wasn't there in the morning. When the district manager finally audited our cash, he called me in with a tight face and a sheet of discrepancies. "Keep your eye on people paying with coins," he said, annoyed, and showed me a photo of the fake paper circles I'd bagged for deposit some night I can't remember. I said I'd be more careful. He said, "We're not a charity." I almost told him we are, actually, at 3 in the morning when the world is small and tired and asking for small mercies. But I nodded and went back to zoning end caps. That afternoon, off shift and unable to sleep, I drove up the forest road where the search volunteers had staged months before. The gate was locked. Behind it, the road turned to ruts. I parked and walked until the trees leaned in enough to be honest. On a stump someone had left a tiny bundle of jute twine and match stubs, laid careful in a circle. I don't believe in offerings, but I didn't touch it. Back at the store on my next night, I opened the drawer where we keep lost and found the ranger's receipt again, the thick one with the pencil date. The year had appeared, 1962. Next to the date, In lighter pencil, as if added later, someone had written, "Still there." I don't know what's still there. The station, the lane through the black timber, the long night where you listen for a voice to crackle back. I only know that sometimes, when the intercom pops and no one's on it, I hear a tone that's not ours and a man who keeps his hat in his hand say, quietly, "Post 41 returning." And without meaning to, I find myself answering, "Copy," because someone should. The only truly scary thing I've learned working nights is that the world has different rules after midnight, and some of them involve being a witness for people who can't go through a door like the rest of us. And if you're kind and you bag their mantles and you don't argue about what year the receipt thinks it is, the store will let them pass. Every now and then a kid dashes out with a plastic lantern, forgets to pay, and my feet move like I should chase him. And then the overhead lights flick once like eyes shutting and I stop, and the breeze that shouldn't be in a sealed building lifts the long receipt spool on lane 12. And for 1 second in the printer glare, I see a pine tree stamped beside a total that says .75, and I think of a tower on a ridge and a voice saying last call, and I almost raised the handset to say something I don't remember learning, like a password, like a prayer. That all for today. Find you very soon. God bless you. Dark North, out now.